Kodiak. The morning mist clung to the waters of Shelikof Strait like a shroud, its tendrils reaching across the dark expanse between the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island. September 15th, 2024, dawned grey and foreboding, the kind of weather that seasoned Alaskan hunters knew could turn deadly without warning. Aboard the 36-foot charter vessel Northern Promise, Captain Jake Henriksen squinted through the wheelhouse windows at the approaching coastline of Afognak Island, his weathered hands gripping the wheel with the practiced ease of someone who had navigated these treacherous waters for over 2 decades. "Should be coming up on Terror Bay in about 20 minutes, Henriksen called back to his passengers, his voice carrying the distinctive cadence of a man born and raised in Kodiak. At 54, he had ferried countless hunting parties to the remote islands that dotted the Kodiak archipelago, but something about this particular group had been nagging at him since they'd departed from Kodiak Harbor at dawn. Eric Sanders stood near the stern, his 28-year-old frame lean but muscular from years of construction work in Anchorage. His dark hair was hidden beneath a well-worn baseball cap, and his green eyes held an intensity that spoke of someone who approached hunting with the same methodical precision he brought to building homes. Eric had been planning this hunt for over 2 years, saving every spare dollar from his job as a framing contractor to afford the guide fees and charter costs. This was supposed to be his dream hunt, a chance to take a massive Kodiak brown bear, the largest subspecies of brown bear in the world. Beside him, his older brother Michael Sanders checked and rechecked his gear with nervous energy. At 31, Michael was 3 inches taller than Eric and carried himself with the confidence of a successful insurance adjuster from Denver. His blonde hair was beginning to thin at the temples, and his blue eyes, so different from his brother's, darted constantly between his equipment and the approaching shoreline. Michael had been reluctant to make this trip initially, preferring his comfortable suburban life to the dangers of big game hunting, but Eric's persistent enthusiasm had finally worn down his resistance. "You sure about this rifle choice, Mike?" Eric asked, hefting his brother's weapon, a .300 Winchester Magnum with a loopholed scope. "These bears can go 1,200 pounds. You might want something with more knockdown power." Michael's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his grip on the rifle. "The guy at the gun shop said this would be plenty. 300 grain bullets, right? That should drop anything." Eric's own choice was more substantial, a .375 H&H Magnum that had belonged to their grandfather, a weapon that had taken dangerous game across 3 continents. The rifle was a family heirloom, its walnut stock worn smooth by decades of use, its barrel blued to a deep black that seemed to absorb light. Their grandfather, Thomas Sanders, had used this very rifle to hunt brown bears in Alaska back in the 1960s, and Eric felt a deep connection to that legacy as he ran his fingers along the familiar contours of the stock. The third member of their hunting party was Samuel "Sam" Rodriguez, a 45-year-old guide from Kodiak who had been hunting these islands for 15 years. Rodriguez was built like a bear himself, stocky and powerful, with graying black hair and dark eyes that missed nothing. He wore the kind of practical outdoor clothing that spoke of someone who lived his life in the wilderness: canvas pants, a wool shirt, and boots that had seen thousands of miles of rough terrain. His rifle was a .458 Winchester Magnum, a dangerous game caliber that he carried with the casual confidence of a man who had faced down charging bears multiple times and lived to tell about it. "Listen up, gentlemen," Rodriguez said, his voice cutting through the engine noise as they approached the island. "I need to go over the safety protocols one more time. Kodiak bears are not like the black bears you might have hunted in the lower 48. These are apex predators that can run 30 miles per hour, climb trees, and swim between islands. A mature boar can weigh over 1,400 pounds and stand over 10 feet tall on his hind legs. They have no natural predators except other bears, and they are not afraid of humans." Eric nodded, having heard similar warnings before, but Michael's face had gone pale beneath his hunting cap. The younger Sanders brother had hunted white-tailed deer in Colorado and elk in Montana, but nothing had prepared him for the prospect of hunting an animal that could easily kill him if things went wrong. "The most important thing to remember," Rodriguez continued, "is that we stay together at all times. These bears are intelligent, and they've been known to circle around and approach from behind. We move as a unit, we shoot as a unit, and if something goes wrong, we stick together. A wounded bear is the most dangerous animal on the planet, and separation means death." Captain Henriksen throttled back the engines as they entered the protected waters of Terror Bay, a name that Eric had initially assumed was some kind of tourist marketing ploy until he learned its history. The bay had earned its ominous moniker in 1883, when a hunting party from San Francisco had been mauled by a massive brown bear that had killed 3 men before finally being brought down by concentrated rifle fire. The incident had made national headlines and cemented Terror Bay's reputation as one of the most dangerous hunting destinations in Alaska. The shoreline that came into view was everything Eric had imagined when he dreamed of this hunt. Dense stands of Sitka spruce and western hemlock rose from the rocky beach, their branches heavy with moisture from the morning mist. Behind the tree line, the terrain rose steeply toward the interior of the island, where vast meadows of sedge grass provided rich feeding for the massive bears that called Afognak home. The entire landscape seemed primordial, untouched by human development, a remnant of the wild Alaska that had existed before oil discoveries and commercial fishing had transformed the state. Dr. Sarah Chen, a wildlife biologist from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, had been studying the Kodiak Archipelago bear population for over a decade. From her research station on the main island, she monitored radio-collared bears throughout the region, tracking their movements and behavior patterns. Her data showed that the Afognak Island population was particularly robust, with an estimated density of 1 bear per square mile, among the highest concentrations of brown bears anywhere in the world. The September hunting season coincides with peak feeding activity, she had explained to hunters in her pre-season briefings. Bears are entering hyperphagia, the phase where they can consume up to 20,000 calories per day in preparation for winter hibernation. This makes them more active, more aggressive, and more likely to approach human hunters who might be perceived as competition for food sources. What Dr. Chen didn't know on that September morning was that radio collar data from bear designation KB247, a massive 12-year-old boar weighing an estimated 1,300 pounds, had gone silent 3 days earlier somewhere on the western shore of Afognak Island. The collar's last transmission had placed the bear within 2 miles of Terror Bay, in exactly the area where the Sanders brothers and their guide we are now preparing to make landfall. KB247, known to researchers as Goliath due to his enormous size, had a documented history of aggressive encounters with humans. In 2019, he had destroyed a fish and game research camp, apparently motivated by the scent of preserved food samples. In 2021, he had stalked a film crew for over 6 hours, forcing them to abort their documentary shoot and call for emergency evacuation. Most concerning was an incident in 2022 where Goliath had approached within 50 yards of a hunting party, showing no fear of humans and requiring numerous warning shots to drive him away. The bear's behavioral profile suggested an animal that had lost his natural fear of humans, a condition that wildlife biologists termed food conditioning. Bears that became food-conditioned were exponentially more dangerous than their wild counterparts, as they associated human presence with potential food sources rather than threats to be avoided. Goliath's massive size and dominant status meant that he had never encountered a situation he couldn't handle through intimidation or brute force, creating a dangerous combination of fearlessness and predatory instinct. As the Northern Promise approached the rocky beach of Terror Bay, none of the men aboard were aware that they were entering the territory of one of the most dangerous individual bears in Alaska. The morning mist that shrouded the coastline also concealed the massive tracks in the sand. Tracks that measured nearly 14 inches long and 8 inches wide, with claw marks that extended another 4 inches beyond the toe pads. "All right, gentlemen, this is as close as I can get you," Captain Henriksen announced, dropping anchor in about 12 feet of water roughly 50 yards from shore. "Sam, you know the drill. I'll be monitoring Channel 16, and you've got the satellite phone if you need emergency extraction." Rodriguez nodded, already loading gear into the inflatable skiff that would ferry them to shore. The boat rocked gently in the swells as they transferred their equipment. 3 rifles, ammunition, camping gear for 3 days, emergency supplies, and a large cooler containing their food for the hunt. The weight of their supplies would normally have required multiple trips, but Rodriguez was anxious to reach shore and establish their base camp before the afternoon weather deteriorated. "How often do hunters actually see bears on these trips?" Michael asked nervously as they loaded into the skiff. His hands were shaking slightly as he gripped his rifle, and Eric noticed that his brother's face had taken on a grayish pallor. "Depends on the season and the hunter's skill," Rodriguez replied, starting the small outboard motor. "In September, visibility rates are about 60% for the week-long hunts. But seeing a bear and getting a clean shot are 2 different things. These animals are incredibly intelligent, and they have all the advantages on their home turf." Eric felt his excitement building as they approached the shore. The rocky beach stretched for several hundred yards in either direction, backed by dense forest that seemed to pulse with hidden life. He could see numerous game trails leading up from the water, worn paths that spoke of decades or centuries of animal traffic. This was what he had dreamed of, genuine wilderness hunting where success would depend entirely on his skills as a woodsman and marksman. "There's good bear sign all along this beach," Rodriguez noted as they ran the skiff up onto the rocks. "Fresh tracks, scat, rubbed trees. The salmon runs ended about 2 weeks ago, so the bears are transitioning to berry feeding and preparing for denning. This is actually one of the best times to hunt them, because they're more predictable in their feeding patterns." What Rodriguez couldn't see from the beach was the massive daybed that Goliath had excavated less than 200 yards inland, hidden in a dense thicket of devil's club and salmonberry bushes. The bear had been watching the shoreline since dawn, his keen sense of smell detecting the approaching humans long before the boat had become visible. At 1,300 pounds, Goliath was past his prime breeding years, but still formidable, his massive skull and powerful jaws capable of crushing bones with casual ease. The bear's behavior over the previous 3 days had been increasingly erratic. His radio collar had malfunctioned after he had rubbed it against a tree while scratching, but not before transmitting data that showed unusual movement patterns. Instead of the normal feeding circuits that characterized bear behavior during hyperphagia, Goliath had been moving in tight circles around the Terror Bay area, as if guarding territory or stalking prey. Dr. Chen's research had documented similar behavior in bears that were approaching the end of their natural lifespan. As dominant boars aged and their physical capabilities declined, they sometimes became more aggressive and unpredictable, perceiving threats where none existed and reacting with violence that younger bears might avoid. Goliath's documented encounters with humans suggested an animal that was already displaying such behavioral changes, making him exponentially more dangerous than a typical brown bear. The process of unloading their gear and establishing base camp took nearly 2 hours. Rodriguez selected a site approximately 100 yards inland from the beach, in a small clearing that provided good visibility in all directions while being sheltered from the worst of the coastal wind. The location was tactically sound from a safety standpoint, but none of the men realized they were setting up camp directly on one of Goliath's primary travel corridors, a path the massive bear had used regularly for over 5 years. "First rule of bear camp," Rodriguez instructed as they set up their tents, "is that we keep all food, toiletries, and scented items at least 100 yards from where we sleep. Bears have a sense of smell that's 7 times better than a bloodhound, and they can detect human food from miles away." Eric and Michael worked together to establish their sleeping area while Rodriguez prepared the food cache. The brothers' relationship had always been complicated. Eric, the adventurous younger sibling who constantly pushed boundaries. Michael, the cautious older brother who preferred safety and predictability. This hunting trip represented a compromise between their different personalities, a chance for them to share an experience that Eric craved and Michael feared. "You remember when Dad used to take us hunting when we were kids?" Eric asked as he staked out his tent. "You were always the careful one, making sure we followed all the safety rules." Michael smiled for the first time since leaving the boat. "Someone had to keep you from getting us both killed. You would have charged into the woods after any animal you saw if I hadn't been there to slow you down." Their father, Robert Sanders, had been an avid hunter who had instilled a love of the outdoors in both his sons, though they had expressed that love in very different ways. Eric had embraced the adventure and danger of hunting, progressing from small game to increasingly challenging quarry. Michael had enjoyed the planning and preparation aspects of hunting, but had never been comfortable with the actual killing, preferring to let Eric take the shots while he provided support and observation. The irony was that Michael was actually the better marksman of the two brothers. His methodical nature and attention to detail made him deadly accurate with a rifle, while Eric's aggressive hunting style sometimes led to hurried shots and missed opportunities. Their father had recognized this difference and had spent countless hours training Michael in precision shooting, hoping to build his confidence in the field. "I brought Dad's old shooting journal," Michael said, pulling a worn leather notebook from his pack. "Remember how he used to record every shot, every hunt, every detail? I thought maybe we could add this trip to it." Eric felt a surge of emotion looking at their father's handwriting on the pages. Robert Sanders had died 3 years earlier from a heart attack, leaving behind a legacy of outdoor adventures and hunting stories that had shaped both his sons' lives. This hunt on Kodiak Island represented a pilgrimage of sorts, a chance to honor their father's memory while creating new stories of their own. What neither brother knew was that their father's journal contained detailed notes about brown bear behavior, gathered during his own hunting trips to Alaska in the 1980s and 1990s. Robert Sanders had been a careful observer of wildlife, and his notes included warnings about food-conditioned bears and the importance of maintaining proper distances from large predators. Had they read those sections of the journal, they might have been better prepared for what was about to unfold. Rodriguez finished securing the food cache in a bear-proof container that he suspended between 2 trees using a complex pulley system. The container was positioned 12 feet above ground and 4 feet from the nearest tree trunk, making it theoretically impossible for even the largest bear to access. However, Goliath's size and intelligence made him capable of problem-solving that would defeat most bear-proofing methods, and his food conditioning meant he would be more persistent than a typical wild bear in attempting to access human food sources. "All right, gentlemen," Rodriguez said, checking his watch as afternoon shadows began to lengthen across their campsite. "It's almost 3 o'clock, which gives us about 4 hours of good hunting light. Bears are most active in the early morning and late evening, so this is prime time. We'll start with a reconnaissance patrol, get familiar with the terrain, and look for fresh sign." The trio began their first patrol by following a well-worn game trail that led inland from their camp. The path was clearly ancient, worn deep into the earth by generations of animals moving between the coastal feeding areas and the interior of the island. Fresh tracks were visible in the soft soil, not just bears, but also Sitka black-tailed deer, river otters, and various smaller mammals that formed the complex ecosystem of Afognak Island. "Look at the size of these tracks," Eric whispered, kneeling beside a perfect bear print preserved in a patch of mud. The track was enormous, easily the largest he had ever seen, with clearly defined pad marks and claw scratches that extended well beyond the toes. "This has got to be from a really big boar." Rodriguez examined the track with growing concern. His 15 years of guiding experience had taught him to read bear sign like other men read newspapers, and what he was seeing made his blood run cold. The track was not only massive, but also showed characteristics that suggested an animal with unusual confidence around humans. The stride length indicated a bear moving at a casual walk rather than the hurried pace typical of bears avoiding human contact. "This track is fresh," Rodriguez said quietly, "maybe 6 to 8 hours old, and based on the size, we're looking at an animal that could go 13 or 1400 pounds. That's trophy class, but it's also extremely dangerous." Michael's grip tightened on his rifle as he processed this information. He had been having second thoughts about this hunt since leaving Kodiak, and the reality of tracking such a massive predator was making his anxiety spike to dangerous levels. His hands were trembling visibly now, and sweat was beading on his forehead despite the cool afternoon temperature. "Are you sure we're properly equipped for something this big?" Michael asked, his voice betraying his nervousness. "I mean, what if my rifle isn't powerful enough?" "Your 300 Win Mag will do the job if you place your shots correctly," Rodriguez assured him, though privately he was having his own doubts. A bear of this size would require perfect shot placement to ensure a quick, clean kill, and he could see that Michael was already showing signs of buck fever before they had even encountered their quarry. Eric, meanwhile, was practically vibrating with excitement. This was exactly what he had dreamed of, the chance to hunt a truly massive bear in genuine wilderness conditions. The danger only added to the appeal for him, validating his decision to spend 2 years saving for this hunt. He ran his hands over his grandfather's .375H and H Magnum, feeling the weight of family history and hunting tradition in the familiar wooden stock. "We need to be extra careful with an animal this size," Rodriguez continued as they followed the trail deeper into the forest. "Big boars like this are often past their prime, which can make them unpredictable and aggressive. They've learned that their size intimidates other animals, including humans, and they may not show the natural wariness that keeps most bears alive." The forest around them was typical of southeast Alaska coastal regions. Dense stands of Sitka spruce and western hemlock created a canopy that filtered the afternoon sunlight into a dappled green twilight. The understory was thick with devil's club, salmonberry, and other shrubs that provided excellent cover for large animals. Visibility was limited to about 50 yards in most directions, which heavily favored any bear that might be stalking them. What the men didn't realize was that they were being watched. Goliath had detected their scent from over a mile away and had been paralleling their movement since they left camp. His massive bulk moved through the dense vegetation with surprising stealth, a skill developed over years of successful hunting and territorial disputes with other bears. The bear's behavior was consistent with a predator evaluating potential prey rather than an animal seeking to avoid human contact. Dr. Chen's research had documented similar stalking behavior in food-conditioned bears throughout the Kodiak archipelago. Bears that had lost their fear of humans often displayed hunting behavior similar to their pursuit of salmon or other prey species. They would follow human groups for hours or even days, learning their patterns and waiting for opportunities to approach food sources or investigate interesting scents. The psychological profile that Dr. Chen had developed for Goliath based on years of observation data painted a picture of an extremely intelligent and dangerous animal. The bear had demonstrated problem-solving abilities that exceeded normal parameters for his species, including the ability to open supposedly bear-proof containers and navigate complex human-made obstacles. His size and dominance had created a feedback loop where successful aggressive encounters reinforced his willingness to engage with humans rather than avoid them. "We're getting close to the ridge, where I've seen the biggest concentration of bear sign," Rodriguez said as they climbed steadily upward through the forest. "There's a series of berry patches up there that attract bears from all over this part of the island. If we're going to encounter your trophy animal, that's where it'll happen." The terrain was becoming more challenging as they gained elevation. Steep slopes, fallen logs, and dense vegetation created numerous obstacles that slowed their progress and limited visibility even further. Eric was in his element, moving through the wilderness with the confidence of someone who had spent years hunting in difficult terrain. Michael, however, was struggling with both the physical demands of the hunt and his increasing anxiety about encountering a massive bear in such close quarters. "Take your time, Mike," Eric encouraged his brother, noticing his labored breathing and obvious discomfort. "We're not in a race here. The important thing is that we stay alert and ready for anything." Michael nodded, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. His insurance work had kept him in decent physical shape, but nothing had prepared him for the demands of hunting in Alaska wilderness. Every step required careful foot placement to avoid slipping on wet rocks or getting tangled in dense vegetation. His rifle felt increasingly heavy in his hands, and he found himself constantly checking to make sure a round was chambered and the safety was in the correct position. The brothers' different approaches to hunting were becoming more apparent as they progressed deeper into bear territory. Eric moved with aggressive confidence, constantly scanning for sign and opportunities, his grandfather's rifle held ready for immediate use. Michael was more cautious and methodical, taking time to observe and process his surroundings before making decisions. But his caution was increasingly tinged with fear rather than tactical awareness. Rodriguez found himself in the difficult position of managing two clients with very different skill levels and psychological profiles. Eric's confidence was valuable, but could become dangerous if it led to reckless decisions. Michael's caution was appropriate for the situation, but could become a liability if it prevented him from taking necessary action in a crisis. The guide's job was to balance these competing factors while keeping everyone alive and hopefully successful in harvesting a bear. "Hold up!" Rodriguez whispered suddenly, raising his hand to halt their progress. "I'm hearing something ahead of us." "Sounds like feeding activity." The three men froze, straining their ears to identify the sounds that had alerted their guide. Through the forest noise of wind in the trees and distant bird calls, they could hear the distinctive sounds of a large animal moving through vegetation, the crack of breaking branches, the rustle of disturbed undergrowth, and what sounded like heavy breathing or snuffling. "Is that a bear?" Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. Rodriguez nodded slowly, his experienced ear identifying the feeding sounds of a large brown bear working through a berry patch. The sound suggested an animal that was completely focused on feeding, unaware of the approaching hunters, which created both an opportunity and a significant danger. A surprised bear was exponentially more dangerous than one that had detected human presence and chosen to continue feeding. "We're going to move very slowly toward that ridge," Rodriguez instructed in whispers. "Keep your rifles ready, but don't chamber rounds until I tell you. We want to get visual contact and assess the situation before we make any decisions about taking a shot." The final approach to the berry patch required nearly 30 minutes of careful stalking. Each step had to be placed with precision to avoid snapping twigs or rustling vegetation that might alert the bear to their presence. Eric felt his heart rate climbing as they got closer, the excitement of potentially encountering a massive bear, combining with the very real danger of the situation to create an almost euphoric state of heightened awareness. Michael, meanwhile, was fighting to control his breathing and the shaking in his hands. The sounds of the feeding bear seemed impossibly loud and close, though Rodriguez had indicated they were still at least 100 yards away from the source. Every shadow in the dense forest seemed to conceal a massive predator, and Michael found himself jumping at every small noise or movement in the periphery of his vision. The berry patch, when they finally reached a position where they could observe it, was a scene from a nature documentary. A natural clearing of about 2 acres was thick with ripe salmon berries, blueberries and elderberries, exactly the type of high-calorie food source that bears sought during their pre-hibernation feeding frenzy. Fresh bear sign was everywhere, trampled vegetation, claw marks on trees, and numerous daybeds where bears had rested during feeding sessions, but the massive animal they had been hearing was nowhere to be seen. "Where did it go?" Eric whispered, scanning the clearing with increasing frustration. "We could hear it feeding just minutes ago." Rodriguez was studying the scene with growing unease. His experience told him that bears didn't simply vanish from feeding areas without cause. Either the animal had detected their approach and retreated, or it had moved to a position where it could observe them while remaining hidden. Given the size of the tracks they had been following, neither possibility was particularly comforting. "Bears are incredibly intelligent," Rodriguez explained quietly. "They can detect human scent from over a mile away, and they're capable of complex tactical thinking. If this animal detected our approach, it might have moved to a position where it can watch us without being seen." The possibility that they were being observed by a massive predator that had outmaneuvered them sent a chill through all 3 hunters. The dense forest that had seemed like exciting hunting terrain now felt oppressive and threatening, filled with potential hiding places for an animal that could kill any of them with casual ease. Michael's anxiety reached a breaking point as the implications of their situation became clear. "Maybe we should head back to camp," he suggested, trying to keep his voice steady. "We can try again tomorrow morning when visibility is better." Eric was reluctant to abandon what might be their best opportunity to encounter a trophy bear, but even he was beginning to feel the psychological pressure of potentially being stalked by an unseen predator. The excitement of the hunt was giving way to a more primitive fear response as his brain processed the reality of their situation. "Sam's right that we need to be smart about this," Eric said finally. "Let's circle back toward camp, but take a different route. Maybe we'll cut fresh sign or get another opportunity." Rodriguez nodded, relieved that his clients were showing good judgment about the tactical situation. However, his relief was short-lived as he realized that their return route to camp would take them through even denser forest with more limited visibility and escape routes. The approaching evening also meant that light conditions would continue to deteriorate, further favoring any bear that might be tracking their movements. What none of the men knew was that Goliath had indeed detected their approach to the berry patch and had circled around to a position where he could observe them from less than 70 yards away. The massive bear's behavior was consistent with a predator that was evaluating potential threats rather than prey. But his willingness to approach so closely to armed humans demonstrated the dangerous lack of fear that characterized food-conditioned bears. Dr. Chen's behavioral studies had documented similar encounters where bears had essentially hunted human hunters, using their superior knowledge of local terrain and their ability to move silently through dense vegetation to gain tactical advantages. These encounters almost always ended badly for the humans involved, as even experienced hunters were poorly equipped to deal with an intelligent predator that was actively stalking them. The return journey to camp began uneventfully, with Rodriguez leading them along a game trail that paralleled their earlier route, while providing different terrain and sight lines. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, creating the kind of dappled shadows and uncertain visibility that made hiking in bear country increasingly dangerous. Sound seemed to carry differently in the cooling air, making it difficult to distinguish between normal forest noise and potential threats. "How far are we from camp?" Michael asked after they had been hiking for about 20 minutes. His earlier anxiety was evolving into a more generalized sense of unease that made every step feel like a potential mistake. "About 1.5 miles," Rodriguez replied, checking his GPS unit to confirm their position. "We should be back well before dark, and then we can plan tomorrow's hunt based on what we learned today." Eric was disappointed that their first day hadn't produced a bear encounter, but he remained optimistic about their chances over the next 2 days. The abundant sign they had seen convinced him that they were in the right area, and he was already planning how they might improve their stalking techniques for tomorrow's hunt. "That was definitely a big bear we heard feeding," Eric said as they descended toward the coast. "Tomorrow we'll get there earlier and set up in a better position. Maybe we can catch him coming in to feed at dawn." "Damn!" The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made all 3 men freeze in place. The unmistakable sound of a large animal crashing through the forest behind them. The noise was getting closer rapidly, indicating something moving toward them at considerable speed through terrain that should have been difficult to navigate quickly. "What is that?" Michael whispered, his rifle coming up to a ready position with reflexes that surprised even him. Rodriguez was already turning to face the sound, his .458 Winchester Magnum held at low ready. His experience told him that bears didn't typically approach humans so directly unless they were either surprised, defending cubs, or displaying aggressive behavior that indicated a dangerous encounter was imminent. The crashing sounds stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving an eerie silence that seemed more threatening than the noise had been. Somewhere in the dense forest behind them, something large was now stationary, but whether it was watching them, preparing to attack, or simply passing through, was impossible to determine. "Could be a bear, could be a deer, could be anything," Rodriguez said quietly, but his body language suggested he believed they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a spooked deer. "We're going to continue toward camp, but we stay alert and ready. If something comes at us, we stand and fight as a unit." The final mile to camp became a psychological endurance test as the 3 hunters tried to balance speed with caution. Every few minutes, they would hear sounds of movement in the forest around them, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes to their flanks. The sounds suggested they were being paralleled by something large and intelligent, but they never got a visual confirmation of what was tracking them. Michael's hands were shaking so badly that he could barely hold his rifle steady, and sweat was pouring down his face despite the cool temperature. The psychological pressure of being hunted by an unseen predator was breaking down his mental defenses and threatening to trigger panic that could get them all killed. "Just keep moving," Eric encouraged his brother, though his own voice was tight with strain. "We're almost back to camp, and then we'll be in a better position to deal with whatever is out there." Rodriguez was privately questioning whether they should have made this hunt at all. The bear sign they had encountered suggested an animal that was both massive and exhibiting behavioral patterns that were far outside normal parameters. Combined with the deteriorating light conditions and the obvious stress his clients were experiencing, he was beginning to think their best option might be to call for early extraction. The relief they felt upon reaching their campsite was palpable, but it was tempered by the realization that they were still in the middle of bear country, with several hours of darkness ahead of them. Their tents and gear looked reassuringly familiar after their afternoon in the wilderness, but the camp's location on a known bear travel corridor now seemed more threatening than tactical. "First priority is getting a fire started," Rodriguez announced, immediately beginning to gather dry wood from the surrounding area. "Bears generally avoid fire, and it'll give us light and warmth for the evening. Then we need to check all our bear-proofing measures and make sure everything is secure." The process of establishing their evening routine helped restore some sense of normalcy after the psychological stress of their return journey. Eric and Michael worked together to prepare dinner, while Rodriguez completed a perimeter check of their campsite, looking for any sign that bears had approached while they were away hunting. "The food cache looks undisturbed," Rodriguez reported after completing his inspection. "No fresh tracks around camp, and I don't see any evidence that we've had visitors. But we need to be extra careful tonight. That animal we heard following us knows where we are now." Dinner was a subdued affair, as each man processed the events of their first day and tried to prepare mentally for the challenges ahead. The abundant bear sign they had discovered was both encouraging from a hunting perspective and terrifying from a survival standpoint. The knowledge that they were sharing the island with predators capable of killing them was a constant presence in their thoughts. "Tell me about the biggest bear you've ever guided someone to," Eric asked Rodriguez as they sat around the fire after dinner. "I'm trying to get a sense of what we might be dealing with out there." Rodriguez stared into the flames for a long moment before responding. "Biggest bear I ever guided was taken about 5 years ago, right here on Afognak. Client was an experienced hunter from Texas who had taken dangerous game all over the world. We spent 4 days tracking a massive boar that kept eluding us, always staying one step ahead, no matter what we tried." "How big was it when you finally got it?" Michael asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. 1,200 pounds live weight, squared at just over 9 feet, Rodriguez replied. But what made that bear special wasn't just his size, it was his intelligence. He seemed to understand that we were hunting him, and he was hunting us right back. We only succeeded because we got lucky and caught him in an open meadow where he couldn't use cover to his advantage. The story did nothing to improve Michael's already frayed nerves, but Eric found it encouraging. The prospect of matching wits with such an intelligent and dangerous adversary was exactly what he had hoped for when planning this hunt. "What's the best strategy for hunting bears that are that smart?" Eric asked. "Patience and persistence," Rodriguez answered. "Smart bears make mistakes eventually, usually because their feeding needs overcome their caution. The key is being ready when that moment comes and making sure your first shot counts because you probably won't get a second chance." As darkness settled over their camp, the 3 men established a watch schedule that would ensure someone was always alert and armed throughout the night. The fire would be maintained continuously, both for warmth and as a psychological deterrent to any bears that might approach their campsite. Michael volunteered for the first watch, partly because he doubted he would be able to sleep anyway. His anxiety about their situation had evolved into a hyper-vigilant state that made rest impossible. He sat near the fire with his rifle across his knees, staring out into the darkness beyond their small circle of light and jumping at every sound from the surrounding forest. Eric and Rodriguez settled into their tents but remained fully clothed with their rifles within easy reach. The normal sounds of an Alaska wilderness night, wind in the trees, distant bird calls, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth, now carried sinister possibilities that kept both men on edge despite their exhaustion from the day's hunting. What they couldn't know was that Goliath was indeed nearby, positioned approximately 150 yards from their campsite in a dense thicket that provided perfect concealment. The massive bear had followed them back to camp, and was now observing their evening routine with the patience of a predator that had all the time in the world to evaluate the situation. The bear's behavior was consistent with territorial assessment rather than immediate predatory intent, but his willingness to remain so close to armed humans throughout the evening demonstrated the dangerous fearlessness that characterized food-conditioned animals. Dr. Chen's research data would have predicted exactly this type of encounter based on Goliath's documented behavioral patterns, but that data was locked away in research files that the hunting party had no access to. The first watch passed without incident, though Michael was convinced he had heard large animals moving in the forest around their camp. The sounds were subtle and intermittent, easily dismissed as normal wildlife activity, but the pattern suggested systematic observation rather than random animal movement. Eric took the second watch at midnight, feeling more confident about their situation than his brother had. His experience hunting in remote areas had taught him to distinguish between normal nighttime forest activity and genuine threats, and nothing he observed triggered serious concern. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" Eric asked Rodriguez quietly as they changed watch positions. "Cautious," the guide replied honestly. "That bear sign we found today suggests we're dealing with an animal that's both massive and potentially unpredictable. We need to be smarter and more careful than we were today." "Are you thinking we should modify our hunting strategy?" "I'm thinking we need to hunt this bear like it's hunting us," Rodriguez said grimly. "Smart, patient, and ready for anything. Bears like this don't make many mistakes, so when they do, we have to be ready to capitalize immediately." Eric's watch passed more peacefully than Michael's had, with only the normal sounds of a coastal forest at night disturbing the silence around their camp. He found the experience meditative rather than stressful, enjoying the solitude and the opportunity to reflect on their first day of hunting. Rodriguez took the final watch beginning at 4 in the morning, timing his shift to coincide with the pre-dawn period when bear activity typically peaked. His 15 years of guiding experience had taught him that the hours just before sunrise were when most dangerous wildlife encounters occurred, as nocturnal feeders concluded their evening activities and diurnal species began their morning routines. The eastern horizon was just beginning to show the faintest hint of dawn when Rodriguez heard the sound that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. The distinctive huffing and jaw-popping of an agitated brown bear coming from somewhere very close to their campsite. The sounds indicated an animal that was stressed or angry, displaying the kind of aggressive body language that typically preceded an attack. Rodriguez immediately began waking his clients, moving as quietly as possible to avoid triggering whatever was making the threatening sounds in the darkness beyond their fire. Both brothers came awake instantly, their hunting experience telling them that their guide's urgent whispers meant immediate danger. "There's a bear very close to camp," Rodriguez whispered as Eric and Michael grabbed their rifles. "It's displaying aggressive behavior, which means we need to be ready for a possible charge. Stay calm, stay together, and be ready to shoot if it comes at us." The three men positioned themselves with their backs to the fire, rifles ready, peering out into the pre-dawn darkness for any sign of the bear that was clearly nearby. The huffing and jaw-popping sounds continued intermittently, sometimes seeming to come from one direction, sometimes from another, suggesting either multiple bears or a single animal that was moving around their perimeter. "Can you see anything?" Michael whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Not yet," Rodriguez replied, "but bears can move almost silently when they want to. The fact that this one is making noise suggests it's either trying to intimidate us or it's so agitated that it's not thinking tactically." Eric felt his excitement building despite the obvious danger of the situation. This was exactly the kind of encounter he had dreamed of, a face-to-face meeting with a massive predator in genuine wilderness conditions. His grandfather's rifle felt solid and reassuring in his hands, and he found himself hoping that whatever was out there would show itself so they could assess the situation properly. The sounds stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving in silence that felt more ominous than the aggressive vocalizations had been. Somewhere in the darkness, a massive predator had gone silent, which could mean it was retreating or preparing for an attack. The three hunters maintained their defensive positions, knowing that relaxing their vigilance too early could be fatal. Dawn came slowly to the Kodiak archipelago, with grey light gradually replacing the absolute darkness that had concealed whatever had been threatening their camp. As visibility improved, Rodriguez began a careful visual survey of their perimeter, looking for any sign of the bear that had been so close just minutes earlier. "There," Eric whispered, pointing toward a gap in the forest about 70 yards from their camp. "Something big just moved through that opening." Rodriguez focused on the area Eric had indicated, but whatever had been there was gone by the time his eyes found the location. However, when he examined the ground later that morning, he would find tracks that confirmed their worst fears. A bear of extraordinary size had indeed approached within 50 yards of their sleeping camp and had spent at least 30 minutes observing them before withdrawing. "I think it's moved off," Rodriguez said after several minutes of careful observation. "But we need to assume it's still in the area and could come back at any time. Today's hunt is going to require a completely different approach." The encounter had shaken all three men, though they reacted in characteristic ways. Eric was energized by the close call, interpreting it as confirmation that they were in the right area to encounter a trophy bear. Michael was badly rattled, his already fragile confidence further undermined by the realization of how vulnerable they had been while sleeping. Rodriguez was professionally concerned, recognizing behavioral patterns that suggested they were dealing with a bear that had crossed the line from wild animal to active threat. "We need to talk about safety protocols," Rodriguez said, as they prepared breakfast and planned their day. "Last night's encounter suggests we're dealing with a bear that's not showing normal fear responses to humans. That makes it exponentially more dangerous than typical hunting situations." "What do you recommend?" Eric asked, though his tone suggested he was hoping they would continue hunting rather than abort the trip. "We hunt, but we hunt smart," Rodriguez replied. "We stay together at all times, we avoid areas with limited visibility, and we don't pursue any bear unless we have clear shots and good escape routes. One mistake with an animal like this could kill us all." Michael was privately hoping that Rodriguez would recommend calling for early extraction, but he didn't want to be the one to suggest ending the hunt that Eric had planned for so long. His insurance background had taught him to evaluate risks carefully, and everything about their situation suggested danger levels that far exceeded acceptable parameters. "Maybe we should consider a different area," Michael suggested as a compromise. "If this particular bear is so dangerous, there might be better hunting elsewhere on the island." Rodriguez shook his head. "Moving would take a full day of travel, and there's no guarantee we wouldn't encounter the same problems elsewhere. Plus, if this bear is as big as the tracks suggest, he represents exactly the kind of trophy you came here to hunt." The decision was made to continue hunting, but with significantly increased caution and modified tactics, designed to minimize their vulnerability to stalking behavior. They would focus on areas with good visibility and multiple escape routes, avoid dense forest where bears could approach undetected, and maintain constant communication and mutual support. The morning hunt began with a thorough examination of the tracks around their campsite, which confirmed that they had indeed been visited by a bear of extraordinary size. The clearest print measured just over 13 inches in length, with claw marks extending nearly 5 inches beyond the toe pads, dimensions that suggested an animal approaching the maximum recorded size for Kodiak brown bears. "This is the biggest bear track I've ever seen," Rodriguez admitted, photographing the print with his digital camera for documentation purposes. "We're talking about an animal that could go 1,400 pounds or more. That's trophy class, but it's also more dangerous than anything any of us have ever hunted." Eric felt his excitement reaching fever pitch as he examined the massive track. This was exactly what he had dreamed of, the chance to hunt a truly legendary bear in conditions that would test every skill he possessed. The danger only added to the appeal, validating his decision to spend 2 years saving for this once-in-a-lifetime hunt. Michael, meanwhile, was studying the track with growing horror as the reality of what they were facing became clear. The sheer size of the print made it obvious that they were dealing with a predator that could kill any of them with casual ease, and the proximity of the track to their sleeping area demonstrated how vulnerable they had been throughout the night. "Are you absolutely sure our rifles are powerful enough for something this big?" Michael asked, his voice betraying his nervousness. "With proper shot placement, yes," Rodriguez assured him. "But that's the key. Shot placement has to be perfect. A wounded bear of this size would be the most dangerous situation any of us could face." The psychological pressure of hunting such a massive and potentially aggressive bear was affecting all 3 men differently. Eric channeled his anxiety into focused excitement, using the adrenaline rush to sharpen his hunting instincts. Michael struggled with increasing fear that threatened to paralyze his decision-making ability. Rodriguez fell back on his professional training, treating the situation as a dangerous but manageable challenge that required careful planning and execution. Their hunting strategy for the day was built around the assumption that they were dealing with an intelligent and potentially aggressive bear that was already aware of their presence and location. Instead of trying to surprise the animal, they would hunt in areas where they could see it coming and have time to prepare for a shot. "We're going to work the edge of that large meadow about a mile north of here," Rodriguez explained as they prepared to leave camp. "It's got good visibility in all directions, multiple escape routes, and it's a known feeding area. If this bear is following normal patterns, he'll show up there eventually." The meadow Rodriguez had selected was a natural clearing of approximately 10 acres, surrounded by forest but open enough to provide excellent sight lines in all directions. A small creek meandered through the center of the meadow, providing water that attracted both bears and their prey species. Fresh sign was abundant, tracks, scat, and feeding areas that indicated regular use by multiple bears. The 3 hunters established an observation position on a low ridge overlooking the meadow, providing them with commanding views while keeping them concealed in the tree line. The position offered multiple retreat routes and clear fields of fire in all directions, exactly the kind of tactical advantage they needed when dealing with a dangerous predator. "Now we wait," Rodriguez said as they settled into their observation post. "Bears are creatures of habit, and if this animal has been using this meadow regularly, he'll show up eventually. The key is patience and being ready when he does appear." The waiting was the hardest part for all 3 men. Eric struggled with his natural impatience and aggressive hunting style, wanting to actively pursue their quarry rather than wait for it to come to them. Michael found that the enforced stillness gave him too much time to think about the danger they were facing, allowing his anxiety to build to potentially paralyzing levels. Rodriguez used his experience to remain focused and alert, constantly scanning for any sign of movement or change in the environment. The morning passed slowly, with only small wildlife providing any activity in the meadow below them. Deer moved through occasionally, along with various bird species and smaller mammals, but there was no sign of the massive bear whose tracks had dominated their campsite. "How long do we typically wait in a position like this?" Michael asked after they had been observing for nearly 3 hours. "As long as it takes," Rodriguez replied. Bear hunting is 90% patience and 10% action. The bears don't operate on our schedule, and rushing things is the fastest way to end up with no bear and a dangerous situation. Eric was beginning to second-guess their strategy when Rodriguez suddenly tensed, his experienced eyes detecting movement at the far edge of the meadow. Something large was moving through the forest, approaching the clearing with the deliberate pace of an animal that was completely comfortable in its territory. "Movement at 2 o'clock, Rodriguez whispered, indicating the location with minimal hand gestures. "Something big coming toward the meadow. Get ready, but don't move until I tell you." All three hunters focused their attention on the area Rodriguez had indicated, straining their eyes to identify whatever was approaching. The movement was subtle and intermittent, suggesting an animal that was being cautious but not particularly concerned about potential threats. When Goliath finally emerged from the tree line, the sight took their breath away. The bear was absolutely massive, easily the largest any of them had ever seen. His coat was a rich chocolate brown with silver-tipped guard hairs that seemed to shimmer in the afternoon sunlight. His head was enormous, with small ears that seemed almost comically disproportionate to his massive skull. When he reared up on his hind legs to test the air currents, he stood nearly 11 feet tall, a mountain of muscle and bone that dominated the landscape around him. "My God," Eric whispered, his voice filled with awe. "He's incredible." The bear dropped back to all fours and began moving across the meadow with surprising grace for such a massive animal. His gait was confident and unhurried, the walk of an apex predator that had never encountered a situation it couldn't handle. Every few steps, he would pause to test the air or examine something on the ground, but he showed no signs of detecting the hunters who were observing him from the ridge. "Range is about 250 yards, Rodriguez calculated quietly. "That's a long shot for a bear, but it's doable with good placement. Eric, you've got the most powerful rifle, so you take the first shot. Michael, you back him up. I'll be watching for any sign of a charge." Eric felt his heart pounding as he settled into a shooting position behind his grandfather's .375 H&H Magnum. The bear was quartering away from them, presenting a perfect angle for a shot that would penetrate deep into the chest cavity and reach vital organs. The distance was challenging but well within his capabilities, and the clear conditions provided excellent visibility. "Take your time," Rodriguez coached quietly. "Steady breathing, smooth trigger pull. You want to place that bullet right behind the shoulder, about 1/3 of the way up the body. That'll give you heart and lung damage that should drop him quickly." Eric found his natural shooting position and began the familiar routine that had been drilled into him through years of practice. He controlled his breathing, found his natural point of aim, and began applying steady pressure to the trigger. The bear continued feeding, unaware that he was being lined up in the crosshairs of a rifle that could kill him instantly. But as Eric's finger tightened on the trigger, Goliath suddenly raised his head and looked directly at their position on the ridge. The bear's small dark eyes seemed to focus on exactly where the hunters were concealed, and his body language changed instantly from relaxed feeding to alert attention. For several long seconds, predator and hunters stared at each other across the meadow, each evaluating the threat presented by the other. "He knows we're here," Rodriguez whispered urgently. "Take the shot now, before he moves." Eric tried to settle back into his shooting position, but the psychological pressure of being observed by such a massive predator was affecting his concentration. His hands were starting to shake slightly, and his breathing had become irregular, factors that could easily cause a miss at such a critical moment. "I can't get steady," Eric admitted, his voice tight with frustration. "He's looking right at us, and it's throwing off my concentration." "Mike, can you take the shot?" Rodriguez asked quickly. recognizing that they might lose their opportunity if they hesitated much longer. Michael had been following the situation with growing dread, and the prospect of being the one to shoot at such a massive and clearly alert predator pushed his anxiety to breaking point. His hands were shaking visibly, and sweat was pouring down his face despite the cool temperature. "I don't think I can make a clean shot at this distance," Michael admitted honestly. "I'm too shaken up to trust my marksmanship right now." Rodriguez found himself in an impossible situation. His clients were both experiencing the kind of buck fever that made accurate shooting nearly impossible. But the bear was clearly aware of their presence and could either flee or attack at any moment. His professional responsibility was to keep his clients safe, but that might require him to take a shot that would technically belong to them. The standoff continued for nearly a minute, with Goliath remaining motionless while he evaluated the threat presented by the hunters. His behavior was unlike anything Rodriguez had seen in 15 years of guiding. Most bears would have either fled immediately upon detecting humans or approached to investigate. This bear seemed to be making a calculated decision about how to respond. The decision was made for them when Goliath suddenly turned and began moving directly toward their position on the ridge. His gait was purposeful and aggressive, the movement of a predator that had decided to confront rather than avoid a potential threat. The psychological dynamics of the encounter had shifted dramatically. Instead of hunters pursuing prey, they had become potential prey being approached by an apex predator. "He's coming at us," Rodriguez said urgently, raising his own rifle. "Everyone get ready to shoot. If he gets within 50 yards, we open fire and keep shooting until he's down." The sight of 1,300 pounds of angry brown bear moving directly toward them, with obvious hostile intent, was more than Michael's already strained nerves could handle. He started hyperventilating, his rifle shaking so badly that accurate shooting would be impossible even at close range. Eric tried to regain his composure and settle into a shooting position, but the psychological pressure of facing a charging bear was unlike anything he had ever experienced. His grandfather's rifle felt unfamiliar in his hands, and he found himself struggling to remember the basic shooting fundamentals that had been second nature just moments earlier. Rodriguez realized that he might have to handle the situation alone, as both his clients were showing signs of complete psychological breakdown. His .45-8 Winchester Magnum was loaded with 500-grain bullets that should stop even a bear of Goliath's size, but only if he could place his shots accurately under extreme stress. Goliath closed the distance to 100 yards before stopping again, this time rising on his hind legs to get a better view of the hunters. Standing at nearly 11 feet tall, he was an absolutely terrifying sight that seemed to fill the entire horizon. His mouth was partially open, showing massive canine teeth, and his small eyes held an intelligence that was somehow more frightening than simple animal aggression. "Jesus Christ," Eric whispered, his voice filled with awe and terror. "Look at the size of him." The bear dropped back to all fours and resumed his approach, but his pace was more measured now, the movement of a predator that was evaluating rather than attacking. Rodriguez realized that they were witnessing behavior that was far outside normal parameters for wild bears. This animal was displaying tactical thinking and decision-making that suggested a level of intelligence that made him exponentially more dangerous. 50 yards. Rodriguez announced, as Goliath crossed an invisible line that marked the absolute limit of their safety zone. "Everyone shoots now. Aim for the chest and keep firing until he goes down." 3 rifles opened fire simultaneously, the combined sound of the shots echoing across the meadow like thunder. Rodriguez's .458 Winchester Magnum and Eric's .375H and H Magnum both fired powerful bullets designed for dangerous game, while Michael's .300 Winchester Magnum added lighter but still substantial projectiles to the barrage. The first volley of shots struck Goliath in the chest and shoulder area, causing him to stagger but not stopping his forward momentum. The bear's incredible size and bone density allowed him to absorb impacts that would have killed smaller animals instantly, and his adrenaline-fueled charge continued despite the serious wounds he had sustained. "Keep shooting!" Rodriguez yelled, working the bolt of his rifle to chamber another round. "He's not going down!" Eric and Michael both attempted to fire follow-up shots, but the stress of the situation was affecting their accuracy and their ability to operate their rifles smoothly. Eric's second shot went high, passing over the bear's back, while Michael's rifle jammed as he tried to cycle the action too quickly. Rodriguez managed to get off 2 more shots before Goliath reached their position, both bullets striking the massive bear in vital areas. The combined damage from multiple heavy-caliber bullets was finally beginning to affect the bear's ability to continue his charge, but his momentum carried him up the ridge toward the hunter's position. The bear collapsed less than 10 yards from where Rodriguez was standing, his massive body sliding several feet down the slope before coming to rest against a fallen log. For several long moments, none of the hunters moved, uncertain whether the animal was dead or simply wounded and gathering strength for another attack. "Is he dead?" Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. Rodriguez approached carefully, his rifle ready for an insurance shot if the bear showed any signs of life. When he was certain that Goliath was indeed dead, he felt a mixture of relief and sadness that was common among experienced hunters who had taken dangerous game. "He's down," Rodriguez announced, his voice heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. "That was the most dangerous situation I've ever been in as a guide." Eric felt a complex mixture of emotions as he looked at the massive bear that had nearly killed them all. The trophy was everything he had dreamed of and more, easily the largest bear any of them had ever seen, with a skull and hide that would set records. But the encounter had been far more dangerous and psychologically traumatic than anything he had anticipated. Michael was in near shock, his hands still shaking uncontrollably as he tried to process what had just happened. The realization of how close they had all come to being killed was overwhelming, and he found himself unable to approach the dead bear even though the danger had passed. "That bear was actively hunting us," Rodriguez said as they began the process of field dressing their trophy. "I've never seen behavior like that in 15 years of guiding. He wasn't just unafraid of humans, he was treating us like prey." The field dressing process revealed the extent of the damage their bullets had inflicted. Multiple shots had found their mark, with Rodriguez's .458 Winchester Magnum bullets causing the most significant trauma. The bear's incredible size and vitality had allowed him to absorb wounds that would have killed most animals instantly, demonstrating why encounters with such predators were so dangerous even for armed humans. "Look at the size of this skull," Eric marveled as they completed their work. "This is going to score higher than anything in the record books." The skull was indeed enormous, with a massive brain case and teeth that were larger than any they had ever seen. The bear's claws were nearly 6 inches long and razor-sharp, capable of inflicting fatal wounds with a single swipe. Every measurement confirmed that they had encountered and killed one of the largest bears ever documented. But as they prepared to transport their trophy back to camp, none of the hunters realized that their ordeal was far from over. The sound of their gunshots had carried for miles across the island, alerting every bear in the area to the location of their encounter. Among those bears was KB-198, Goliath's equally massive brother, who had been feeding less than 2 miles away when the shooting began. KB-198, known to researchers as Titan due to his size and aggressive nature, had been tracking the scent trail left by his brother for the past day. The two bears had a complex relationship that combined elements of sibling rivalry and territorial competition, but they had occasionally cooperated when facing external threats. The sound of gunfire from the direction of Goliath's last known location triggered an aggressive response that would soon put the hunters in even greater danger. The process of moving their trophy back to camp required several hours of exhausting work, as the bear's massive size made transportation extremely difficult. They were forced to quarter the animal and make multiple trips, leaving parts of their trophy unattended while they shuttled loads back to their campsite. "We need to get this meat processed and packed as quickly as possible," Rodriguez said, as they began the final phase of their work. "The scent is going to attract every predator on the island, and we don't want to be here when they arrive." Eric was already planning how he would display his trophy back home in Anchorage, envisioning the massive skull and hide mounted in his living room as testament to the greatest hunting achievement of his life. The danger and trauma of the encounter were already beginning to fade in his mind, replaced by pride and satisfaction at having successfully hunted one of the most dangerous animals in North America. Michael remained deeply shaken by their experience, unable to fully process the realization of how close they had all come to being killed. His hands continued to shake intermittently, and he found himself jumping at every sound from the surrounding forest. The successful conclusion of their hunt provided little comfort when weighed against the psychological trauma of the encounter. As evening approached and they prepared for their second night on Afognak Island, none of the three hunters realized that Titan was already approaching their campsite, drawn by the scent of his dead brother and motivated by a rage that made him even more dangerous than Goliath had been. The psychological and physical exhaustion from their successful hunt had lowered their guard at exactly the moment when they needed to be most alert. Rodriguez was the first to notice the signs that they were no longer alone in the area around their camp. Fresh tracks appeared near their bear-proof food cache, and the behavior of small wildlife suggested the presence of a large predator nearby. His 15 years of experience told him that they were facing a situation that could rapidly become even more dangerous than their earlier encounter. "We've got company," Rodriguez announced quietly as he examined the new tracks. "Another big bear, possibly larger than the one we took today. And based on these tracks, he's been circling our camp for at least an hour." The realization that they were being stalked by another massive bear pushed Michael completely over the edge psychologically. He began hyperventilating again, and his hands shook so violently that he couldn't maintain a grip on his rifle. The successful hunt that should have been the culmination of their trip had become a nightmare that seemed to have no end. Eric tried to maintain his composure, but even he was beginning to feel the cumulative psychological pressure of dealing with multiple encounters with massive predators. His grandfather's rifle felt heavy in his hands, and he found himself questioning whether they had enough ammunition left to handle another confrontation. "What do we do?" Eric asked, looking to Rodriguez for leadership in a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond their control. "We stay alert, we stay together, and we hope this bear decides to move on," Rodriguez replied, though privately he was beginning to think their best option might be to call for immediate emergency extraction. 2 encounters with massive, aggressive bears in less than 24 hours suggested a level of danger that exceeded anything he had experienced in his guiding career. The second night on Afognak Island became a psychological endurance test, as the 3 hunters maintained constant vigilance against a threat they could sense but not see. Titan's presence was confirmed by periodic sounds of movement in the forest around their camp, but the bear's superior intelligence and knowledge of the terrain kept him hidden while he evaluated the situation. Dr. Chen's research data would later show that Titan had indeed been tracking his brother's movements for several days before the fatal encounter, and that the sound of gunfire had triggered an aggressive response that was unusual even for food-conditioned bears. The psychological bond between the two massive bears had created a situation where the death of one had motivated the other to seek revenge. A level of emotional complexity that challenged conventional understanding of bear behavior. As dawn approached on their third and final day on the island, the exhausted hunters realized that they would need to extract immediately rather than attempt another day of hunting. The psychological trauma of their encounters, combined with the clear evidence that they were being stalked by another massive predator, made continued hunting impossibly dangerous. "I'm calling for extraction as soon as we can reach Captain Henriksen on the radio," Rodriguez announced as they prepared to break camp. "We've got our trophy, and staying here any longer is asking for trouble we can't handle." The process of packing their gear and preparing for extraction took on desperate urgency as evidence mounted that Titan was closing in on their position. Fresh tracks appeared regularly around their campsite, and the bear's behavior suggested an animal that was becoming increasingly bold and aggressive. Eric was torn between relief that they had achieved the goal of their hunt and regret that they were leaving the island under such stressful circumstances. His trophy bear was everything he had dreamed of, but the psychological cost of the encounters had been far higher than he had anticipated. Michael was openly grateful that they were finally leaving, though he remained convinced that their ordeal was far from over. His insurance background had taught him that dangerous situations often escalated rather than resolved themselves, and everything about their circumstances suggested that worse problems lay ahead. Captain Henriksen responded immediately to their radio call for extraction, having monitored weather conditions and remained on standby for exactly this type of emergency. The urgency in Rodriguez's voice told him that his passengers had encountered serious problems, and he immediately began preparing the Northern Promise for departure from Kodiak Harbor. "I'll be at your position in 2 hours," Henriksen radioed back. "Have all your gear staged on the beach and be ready for immediate pickup. Weather's starting to deteriorate, so we need to move fast." The final 2 hours on Afognak Island felt like an eternity as the three hunters waited on the beach for their extraction boat to arrive. Evidence of Titan's presence continued to accumulate, with fresh tracks appearing regularly in the sand around their position. The bear seemed to be testing their defenses, approaching closer with each circuit of their position. When the Northern Promise finally appeared on the horizon, all three hunters felt overwhelming relief at the prospect of escaping from an island that had become a nightmare. The successful hunt and trophy bear seemed almost secondary to their gratitude at surviving encounters that could easily have killed them all. The extraction process went smoothly, despite deteriorating weather conditions, with Captain Henriksen's experience allowing him to navigate the increasingly rough seas safely. As Afognak Island disappeared behind them, the three hunters began the psychological process of coming to terms with their experiences. "That was the most dangerous hunt I've ever guided," Rodriguez admitted as they headed back toward Kodiak Harbor. "Those bears were exhibiting behavior that was far outside normal parameters. I'm not sure we should have been hunting in that area at all." Eric spent the return journey alternating between pride in his achievement and sobering reflection on how close they had all come to disaster. His trophy bear was magnificent, but the psychological cost of obtaining it had been far higher than he had anticipated. Michael remained deeply traumatized by their experiences, unable to find any satisfaction in their successful hunt. The realization of how vulnerable humans were when facing such massive predators had fundamentally changed his perspective on hunting and wilderness adventure. The arrival back at Kodiak Harbor marked the end of their hunting adventure, but the beginning of a long process of psychological recovery and reflection. The trophy bear would be processed and mounted, providing a lasting reminder of their experiences, but the mental and emotional impact of their encounters would take much longer to resolve. Dr. Chen's research station received automated alerts about the cessation of radio signals from both KB-247 and KB-198 within days of the hunting party's return to Kodiak. The loss of two major research subjects simultaneously was unprecedented and suggested encounters with human hunters that had resulted in the deaths of both massive bears. The implications for bear management and hunter safety would be debated for months as wildlife officials tried to understand what had happened on Afognak Island. The behavioral patterns displayed by both bears suggested levels of intelligence and aggression that challenged conventional approaches to managing human-bear interactions in Alaska wilderness areas. Eric's trophy bear would indeed set records, with skull measurements that exceeded anything previously documented for Kodiak brown bears. The mounting process revealed the full extent of the animal's incredible size and power, creating a display that would draw visitors from around the world to see the largest bear ever legally harvested. But the psychological scars left by their encounters would prove more lasting than any trophy. Michael would never hunt again, his anxiety about wildlife encounters making even simple camping impossible. Eric would continue hunting, but with a new respect for the dangers involved and a deeper understanding of his own limitations when facing truly dangerous game. Rodriguez would modify his guiding practices based on their experiences, implementing safety protocols designed to prevent the kind of escalating encounters that had nearly killed them all. His reputation as one of Alaska's most experienced guides would be enhanced by his professional handling of an impossibly dangerous situation. But he would never forget how close they had all come to becoming statistics rather than survivors. The story of their hunt would be told and retold throughout Alaska's hunting community, serving as both inspiration and warning for those who sought to test themselves against the largest and most dangerous predators in North America. The line between hunter and prey had proven to be far thinner than any of them had imagined, and their survival had depended as much on luck as on skill or preparation. In the years that followed their return from Afognak Island, each of the three men would process their experiences differently. Eric channeled his trauma into a deeper appreciation for wilderness conservation, becoming an advocate for bear habitat preservation and research funding. His trophy bear became the centerpiece of educational displays designed to teach other hunters about the realities of hunting dangerous game. Michael used his experience as motivation to change careers, leaving the insurance industry to become a wilderness safety instructor. His first-hand knowledge of how quickly outdoor adventures could become life-threatening situations made him uniquely qualified to teach others about risk assessment and emergency preparedness. Rodriguez continued guiding, but with modified protocols that reflected the lessons learned from their encounters. His reputation for safety and professionalism grew as other guides sought his advice on handling dangerous situations, and he became a respected voice in discussions about bear management and hunter safety. The research implications of their encounters would influence wildlife management policies throughout Alaska and beyond. The behavioral patterns displayed by both Goliath and Titan suggested that food-conditioned bears represented a far greater threat to human safety than had previously been understood, leading to revised protocols for dealing with problem bears in wilderness areas. Dr. Chen's analysis of the incident would be published in multiple scientific journals, establishing new understanding of bear intelligence and behavior that would influence research and management practices for decades. The loss of both research subjects was regrettable, but the data generated by their final encounters provided unprecedented insights into the psychology of apex predators. The Sanders brothers' hunting trip to Kodiak Island would be remembered as one of the most dramatic and dangerous bear hunting encounters ever documented. Their survival was attributed to a combination of good equipment, experienced guidance, and extraordinary luck that allowed them to emerge from situations that could easily have ended in tragedy. The trophy bear that Eric had dreamed of hunting for 2 years would grace his home for the rest of his life, serving as a reminder of both his greatest hunting achievement and his closest encounter with death. The massive skull and hide represented not just a successful hunt, but a confrontation with the raw power and intelligence of one of nature's ultimate predators. Years later, when asked about their experiences on Afognak Island, each of the 3 hunters would emphasize different aspects of their ordeal. Eric would focus on the incredible size and power of the bears they had encountered, marveling at the opportunity to test himself against such magnificent and dangerous animals. Michael would stress the importance of proper preparation and risk assessment, using their story to educate others about the realities of wilderness dangers. Rodriguez would emphasize the critical importance of professional guidance and safety protocols when hunting dangerous game, crediting their survival to careful planning and disciplined execution under extreme stress. The legacy of their hunt would extend far beyond the record book trophy and personal memories of the participants. Wildlife managers throughout North America would study their encounters as examples of how quickly routine hunting situations could escalate into life-threatening emergencies. The behavioral patterns displayed by both bears would influence research into predator psychology and human-wildlife interactions for years to come. The story would also serve as inspiration for other hunters seeking to test themselves against dangerous game, though always with the sobering reminder that such encounters could easily end in disaster rather than success. The line between predator and prey in Alaska wilderness was far thinner than most hunters realized, and survival often depended as much on luck and circumstances as on skill and preparation. In the end, the Sanders brothers' hunt on Kodiak Island would be remembered as a perfect example of both the incredible appeal and the deadly dangers of hunting North America's largest and most dangerous predators. Their survival was a testament to human courage and adaptability, but also a reminder of how quickly civilized men could find themselves reduced to the most primitive struggle for survival against forces beyond their control or comprehension. The massive skull of Goliath, mounted in Eric Sanders' living room in Anchorage, would serve as a permanent reminder of 3 days that had tested every aspect of their courage, skill, and determination to survive. The trophy represented not just a successful hunt, but a confrontation with the raw power of nature that had fundamentally changed all 3 men's understanding of their place in the natural world. The mounting process itself had revealed details about Goliath that were both fascinating and terrifying. The taxidermist, Frank Morrison, had been working with Alaskan big game for over 30 years, but even he was amazed by the sheer size and power evident in the bear's remains. The skull measured an unprecedented 31 2/8 inches, shattering all existing records for Kodiak brown bears. The massive canine teeth were nearly 3 inches long, with wear patterns that suggested an animal that had lived a long and violent life. "I've never seen bone density like this," Morrison told Eric during one of his visits to check on the mounting progress. "This bear's skull is so thick it probably could have stopped a smaller caliber bullet without penetrating to the brain. You're lucky you had the firepower you did." The hide, when fully prepared and measured, stretched to an incredible 10 feet 6 inches square, another record that would likely stand for decades. The rich, chocolate-brown color with silver-tipped guard hairs created a display that seemed to capture the very essence of wild Alaska. When visitors saw the mounted bear for the first time, their most common reaction was stunned silence, as they processed the sheer size of the animal. Dr. Sarah Chen requested tissue samples from the bear for her ongoing research into the genetics and behavior of Kodiak brown bears. Her analysis would reveal that Goliath carried genetic markers associated with exceptional size and longevity, suggesting he came from a bloodline of bears that had dominated the Kodiak archipelago for generations. The genetic data also showed markers linked to increased aggression and reduced fear responses, traits that had made him both a magnificent trophy and an extraordinarily dangerous adversary. This bear represents the absolute pinnacle of brown bear evolution, Dr. Chen explained to Eric when she shared her findings. Everything about his genetics, his size, his behavior patterns suggests an animal that was perfectly adapted to dominate his environment. In many ways, you encountered a living legend. The story of their hunt began to spread throughout Alaska's hunting community almost immediately upon their return to Kodiak. Rodriguez found himself fielding dozens of calls from hunters wanting to book similar expeditions, though he was careful to explain the extreme dangers involved and the exceptional circumstances that had made their encounter possible. "I've guided over 300 bear hunts in my career," Rodriguez would tell prospective clients, "and what happened with the Sanders brothers was completely unprecedented. Most hunters will never encounter bears like that, and frankly, most hunters wouldn't survive if they did." The Alaska Department of Fish and Game conducted a thorough investigation into the circumstances surrounding the deaths of both KB-247 and KB-198. The loss of two major research subjects in such a short time frame was unprecedented and raised questions about the effectiveness of current bear management strategies in the Kodiak archipelago. Wildlife biologist Dr. James Patterson led the investigation, interviewing all three hunters extensively and examining the physical evidence from the encounter sites. His preliminary findings suggested that both bears had exhibited behavioral patterns that were far outside normal parameters for wild brown bears. These animals were displaying levels of aggression and tactical thinking that we typically associate with polar bears or with brown bears that have become habituated to human food sources, Dr. Patterson explained in his preliminary report. The fact that they were actively stalking armed hunters suggests a complete breakdown of natural fear responses that made them extremely dangerous to human safety. The investigation also revealed that both bears had been documented approaching human camps and hunting parties multiple times over the previous 3 years. A pattern of increasingly bold behavior had been building toward exactly the type of confrontation that had ultimately resulted in their deaths. In retrospect, both of these bears should probably have been classified as immediate threats to human safety, Dr. Patterson admitted. Their behavioral patterns were classic examples of food-conditioned animals that had lost their natural fear of humans. "We were lucky that the Sanders hunting party was well armed and experienced enough to survive their encounters." Michael Sanders found himself struggling with severe anxiety and depression in the months following their return from Kodiak Island. The psychological trauma of facing death at the claws of massive predators had triggered a condition that his doctors diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. Sleep became difficult, and he found himself jumping at unexpected sounds or movements in his peripheral vision. "I keep having nightmares about those bears," Michael confided to his brother during one of their regular phone conversations. "Sometimes I wake up convinced that I can hear them outside my house, even though I know that's impossible." Eric tried to be supportive, but he was processing their experiences very differently. For him, the encounters had been terrifying, but ultimately validating. Proof that he could face extreme danger and emerge victorious. The mounted bear in his living room served as a daily reminder of his courage and hunting skill, rather than a source of trauma. "You need to focus on the fact that we survived," Eric would tell his brother. "We faced down two of the most dangerous predators in North America, and lived to tell about it. That's something to be proud of, not traumatized by. But Michael's insurance background had taught him to analyze risks and probabilities, and his analysis of their Kodiak experience convinced him that their survival had been due more to luck than skill. The mathematical reality was that bears of that size and aggression level should have killed all three of them, despite their firearms and experience. Dr. Elizabeth Hawkins, a psychiatrist who specialized in treating outdoor trauma survivors, began working with Michael to address his PTSD symptoms. Her practice included many Alaskans who had survived bear attacks, plane crashes, and other wilderness emergencies, giving her unique insight into the psychological aftermath of such encounters. What you experienced goes far beyond normal hunting stress, Dr. Hawkins explained during one of their sessions. You faced genuine life-threatening danger from apex predators that were actively hunting you. The human brain isn't designed to process that level of threat, especially when it continues for extended periods. The therapy sessions helped Michael understand that his reactions were normal and appropriate, given the extreme nature of their experiences. Gradually, he began to develop coping strategies that allowed him to function normally while acknowledging the reality of what they had survived. Rodriguez found that his reputation as a guide was actually enhanced by their experiences. As word spread throughout Alaska's hunting community about his professional handling of an impossibly dangerous situation. Experienced hunters recognized that lesser guides might have panicked or made tactical errors that could have gotten everyone killed. "Sam Rodriguez is the reason we're all still alive," Eric would tell anyone who asked about their hunt. "His experience and cool thinking under pressure saved us when things went bad. I wouldn't hunt dangerous game with anyone else." The demand for Rodriguez's guiding services increased dramatically, though he was selective about accepting clients who wanted to hunt bears on Kodiak Island. His new protocols required extensive psychological evaluation and marksmanship testing before he would take hunters into areas where they might encounter animals like Goliath or Titan. "I won't guide anyone who isn't prepared for the reality of what we might face out there," Rodriguez explained to prospective clients. "These bears are not like anything most hunters have ever encountered, and freezing up or missing shots can get everyone killed." The story began attracting attention from hunting magazines and outdoor television shows, with multiple organizations requesting interviews and hunting footage. Eric was eager to share their story, seeing it as validation of his hunting achievements, while Michael preferred to avoid publicity that might force him to relive traumatic memories. North American Hunter magazine featured their story as a cover article titled "The Hunt of a Lifetime," complete with detailed photographs of Goliath's massive skull and hide. The article emphasized both the incredible trophy quality of the bear and the extreme dangers involved in hunting animals of such size and aggression. "This represents brown bear hunting at its absolute pinnacle," the magazine's editor wrote in his introduction to the article. "The Sanders brothers and their guide, Sam Rodriguez, faced dangers that would have killed lesser hunters, and their success represents one of the greatest hunting achievements in recent memory." Television producer Mark Stevens contacted Eric about featuring their hunt in an episode of his show, Extreme Hunting Adventures. The program specialized in documenting dangerous game hunting around the world, and Stevens believed their Kodiak experience would make compelling television. "This is exactly the kind of story our viewers want to see," Stevens explained during their initial phone conversation. "Real hunters facing real danger and succeeding through skill and courage. We'd want to film reenactments of the actual encounters using the exact locations and equipment." Eric was enthusiastic about the television opportunity, but Michael refused to participate in any reenactments or interviews. The prospect of revisiting their experiences in such detail was more than his fragile psychological state could handle. "I understand that Eric wants to share our story," Michael told Stevens when the producer called him directly, "but I can't relive those encounters again. They nearly destroyed me psychologically, and I'm still working to recover." The television project moved forward with Eric and Rodriguez providing interviews and technical consultation, while Michael's role in the story was handled through archival footage and third-person narration. The episode, when it aired 6 months later, would become one of the highest rated in the show's history. Dr. Chen's research into the behavioral patterns of both bears revealed disturbing trends that had implications for bear management throughout Alaska. Her analysis of radio collar data showed that both animals had been exhibiting increasingly aggressive behavior toward humans for over 2 years before their fatal encounters. These bears had essentially become predators of humans rather than animals that avoided human contact, Dr. Chen explained in her formal report to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Their size and intelligence made them capable of tactical thinking that treated human hunters as prey rather than threats. The genetic analysis also revealed that both bears were closely related, sharing genetic markers that suggested exceptional size and reduced fear responses were hereditary traits in their bloodline. This raised concerns about other bears in the Kodiak archipelago that might carry similar genetic predispositions. "We may be dealing with a population of bears that are genetically predisposed to dangerous interactions with humans," Dr. Chen warned in her conclusions. "Current management strategies may be inadequate for dealing with animals that possess both exceptional physical capabilities and reduced natural fear responses." The Alaska Board of Game held special hearings to address the implications of the Sanders hunting incident and Dr. Chen's research findings. Wildlife managers, hunting guides, and public safety officials testified about the need for revised protocols when dealing with large, aggressive bears in wilderness areas. "We need to acknowledge that some individual bears represent threats that exceed our current management capabilities," testified Dr. Patterson during the hearings. "These animals require different approaches that prioritize human safety over traditional wildlife management principles." The board ultimately approved new regulations requiring enhanced safety protocols for guided hunts in areas with documented populations of large, aggressive bears. Guides would be required to carry more powerful firearms, maintain satellite communication capabilities, and complete specialized training in dealing with dangerous bear encounters. Rodriguez was among the first guides to complete the new training program, which included tactical shooting drills, emergency communication procedures, and psychological preparation techniques. The program was designed to prepare guides for exactly the type of encounter he had survived with the Sanders brothers. The new training acknowledges the reality that some bears are actively dangerous to humans. Rodriguez explained to other guides during the program, "We can't just rely on traditional hunting skills when we're dealing with predators that are hunting us." Eric's trophy bear became the centerpiece of a traveling display organized by the Boone and Crockett Club to educate hunters about record-class big game animals. The exhibit toured major hunting shows throughout North America, drawing crowds of hunters who wanted to see the largest brown bear ever legally harvested. "This bear represents the absolute pinnacle of what's possible in North American big game hunting," explained club official Robert Mitchell during the display's debut at the Safari Club International Convention. "But it also represents the extreme dangers that hunters face when pursuing animals of this caliber." The display included detailed information about the circumstances of the hunt, emphasizing both the incredible trophy quality of the bear and the life-threatening dangers that had been involved in its harvest. Educational materials stress the importance of proper preparation, professional guidance, and respect for the capabilities of dangerous game animals. Michael eventually returned to limited hunting activities, though he never again pursued dangerous game and avoided wilderness areas where large predators might be encountered. His experiences with therapy and trauma recovery led him to begin speaking at hunter safety courses about the psychological aspects of surviving life-threatening encounters. People focus on the physical preparation for dangerous hunting, Michael would tell his audiences, but they don't consider the psychological demands of facing animals that can kill you. Mental preparation is just as important as marksmanship or physical fitness. His presentations became popular with hunting organizations throughout the Rocky Mountain region, as his first-hand experience with extreme danger gave him credibility that classroom instructors lacked. He found that helping other hunters understand and prepare for psychological challenges gave his traumatic experiences positive meaning. Eric continued hunting dangerous game, but with a new respect for the capabilities of his quarry and the importance of thorough preparation. He hunted brown bears in Alaska twice more, though never again on Kodiak Island, and each subsequent hunt was planned with the lessons learned from his encounter with Goliath. That hunt taught me that there's a difference between hunting dangerous animals and hunting animals that are actively dangerous, Eric would explain to other hunters. Goliath wasn't just big and powerful, he was intelligent and aggressive in ways that made him qualitatively different from other bears. His subsequent hunts were successful, but lacked the intensity and drama of his Kodiak experience. No other bear he encountered displayed the size, intelligence, and aggressive behavior that had made Goliath such a formidable adversary. Rodriguez developed a specialized guiding practice focused exclusively on hunters seeking record-class brown bears in extreme conditions. His reputation for handling dangerous situations safely made him the preferred guide for experienced hunters who wanted to pursue the largest and most dangerous bears in Alaska. After the Sanders hunt, I realized that most guides aren't prepared for truly dangerous encounters, Rodriguez explained to hunting industry publications. I've specialized in situations where things can go wrong quickly and where survival depends on everyone performing perfectly under extreme stress. His client list included some of the most experienced and successful dangerous game hunters in the world, men who specifically sought out the kind of extreme challenges that had nearly killed the Sanders brothers. The psychological profile and skill level required for such hunts eliminated all but the most dedicated and capable hunters. The television episode featuring their hunt won multiple awards from outdoor television organizations and generated tremendous interest in Kodiak brown bear hunting. However, the increased attention also led to concerns about hunter safety, as less experienced hunters sought to duplicate their achievement. We're seeing hunters who watch the show and think they can just book a trip to Kodiak and shoot a record bear, Rodriguez warned in interviews. They don't understand the years of preparation and the extreme dangers involved. Some of these guys are going to get themselves and their guides killed. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game implemented additional screening requirements for brown bear hunting licenses in response to the increased interest generated by the television coverage. Hunters were required to demonstrate marksmanship proficiency with dangerous game calibers and complete safety courses specific to brown bear hunting. Dr. Hawkins published a research paper about the psychological aftermath of extreme hunting encounters, using Michael's case as a primary example of how life-threatening wildlife encounters could trigger long-term psychological trauma, even in experienced outdoorsmen. The assumption that hunters are psychologically prepared for life-threatening encounters with dangerous game is often incorrect, Dr. Hawkins wrote. The reality of facing apex predators that are actively threatening human life creates psychological pressures that exceed normal hunting stress by orders of magnitude. Her research led to the development of psychological preparation programs for hunters planning to pursue dangerous game. The programs included stress inoculation training, visualization exercises, and coping strategies designed to help hunters maintain psychological control during life-threatening encounters. 5 years after their hunt, Eric organized a reunion trip to Alaska for the 3 survivors, though they avoided Kodiak Island in deference to Michael's ongoing anxiety about returning to the scene of their traumatic encounters. Instead, they hunted caribou on the Alaska Peninsula, enjoying a much less stressful hunting experience that allowed them to reconnect without triggering painful memories. "It's good to hunt together again," Michael told his brother, as they sat around their campfire on the final evening of their reunion hunt. "But I'm grateful that we're chasing caribou instead of bears this time." Eric had matured significantly in the years since their Kodiak experience, developing a more measured approach to hunting that balanced his appetite for adventure with realistic assessment of risks and dangers. His marriage to wildlife photographer Jennifer Walsh had given him new perspectives on conservation and the ethics of hunting dangerous game. "Jennifer helped me understand that there's more to being in the wilderness than just hunting," Eric explained to Rodriguez during their reunion. "Those bears we encountered were magnificent animals that deserved our respect, not just our bullets." Rodriguez had used the intervening years to become one of Alaska's most respected authorities on brown bear behavior and hunting safety. His experiences with the Sanders brothers had given him insights that he shared through writing, speaking, and training other guides in advanced safety techniques. "That hunt changed all of our lives," Rodriguez reflected as they prepared to return home from their reunion trip. "We survived something that could easily have killed us, and that experience has to mean something beyond just a trophy on the wall." The legacy of their Kodiak hunt continued to influence brown bear hunting and management throughout Alaska and beyond. Dr. Chen's research into the genetic and behavioral factors that had made Goliath and Titan so dangerous led to new understanding of predator psychology and human-wildlife interactions. These bears represented the extreme end of what's possible in terms of size, intelligence, and aggression, Dr. Chen explained in her final report on the incident. "Understanding how and why they developed such dangerous characteristics helps us predict and manage similar situations in the future. The genetic markers associated with exceptional size and reduced fear responses were identified in several other bears throughout the Kodiak archipelago, leading to enhanced monitoring and management protocols for animals that carried similar risk factors." Michael's recovery from PTSD became a model for treating other outdoor trauma survivors, with Dr. Hawkins's therapeutic approaches being adopted by mental health professionals throughout Alaska and other wilderness regions. His willingness to speak publicly about his psychological struggles helped reduce the stigma associated with trauma reactions among hunters and outdoor enthusiasts. "Admitting that I was traumatized by our experience doesn't make me weak," Michael would tell audiences during his speaking engagements. "It makes me honest about the reality of what we faced and survived. There's strength in acknowledging our limitations and getting help when we need it." Eric's trophy bear remained the centerpiece of his home, but it had evolved from a symbol of hunting prowess to a reminder of the complex relationship between humans and the natural world. His subsequent involvement in wildlife conservation efforts reflected a deepened understanding of the responsibilities that came with taking such magnificent animals. "Goliath was more than just a trophy," Eric would explain to visitors who came to see the mounted bear. "He was a representative of wild Alaska at its most powerful and dangerous. Taking his life was a privilege that carries obligations to protect and preserve the wilderness that created him." The story of their hunt became part of Alaska hunting folklore, told and retold around campfires and in hunting lodges throughout the state. Each telling emphasized different aspects of their experience: the incredible size of the bears, the extreme danger they had faced, or the importance of preparation and professional guidance when hunting dangerous game. Rodriguez continued to guide select clients on brown bear hunts, but he never again encountered animals that matched the size and aggression of Goliath and Titan. His reputation as the guide who had survived the most dangerous brown bear encounter in modern hunting history made him a legend within Alaska's hunting community. "People ask me if I want to encounter bears like that again," Rodriguez would tell interviewers, "and the answer is absolutely not. We were incredibly lucky to survive that hunt, and I have no desire to test fate twice." 10 years after their Kodiak adventure, all three men had found ways to integrate their traumatic experience into positive contributions to hunting safety and wildlife conservation. Their survival had been remarkable, but more important was how they had used their experience to help others understand and prepare for the realities of hunting in Alaska's wilderness. The mounted bear in Eric's living room continued to draw visitors from around the world, serving as both a trophy and an educational tool. Children who saw the massive skull and hide gained immediate understanding of the power and majesty of Alaska's wildlife, while experienced hunters appreciated the incredible achievement and survival story that the trophy represented. "That bear changed my life in ways I never expected," Eric would reflect during interviews marking the anniversary of their hunt. "I went to Alaska thinking I was just pursuing a trophy, but I came back with a much deeper understanding of my place in the natural world and my responsibilities as a hunter." Michael's transformation from traumatized survivor to advocate for hunter safety and mental health awareness had given his experience meaning that transcended the original hunting goals. His work helping other trauma survivors recover from wilderness encounters had touched hundreds of lives and advanced understanding of the psychological demands of extreme outdoor adventures. Rodriguez's evolution from working guide to respected authority on dangerous game hunting had established him as one of Alaska's most valuable resources for hunters planning expeditions in bear country. His training programs and safety protocols had prevented numerous potential tragedies by preparing guides and hunters for the realities they might face in Alaska's wilderness. The scientific legacy of their encounter continued through Dr. Chen's ongoing research into brown bear genetics and behavior. The tissue samples and behavioral data collected from Goliath and Titan had contributed to a new understanding of what created exceptionally dangerous individual bears and how such animals could be identified and managed before they pose threats to human safety. The Sanders hunt gave us insights into brown bear behavior that we never could have obtained through observation alone, Dr. Chen explained in a retrospective analysis published 15 years after the incident. The extreme circumstances of their encounters revealed behavioral and physiological characteristics that helped us understand the upper limits of what these animals are capable of. The story continued to influence hunting practices and wildlife management policies throughout North America, serving as a case study in how quickly routine hunting situations could escalate into life-threatening emergencies. Training programs for guides and wildlife managers used their experience as an example of both the dangers inherent in big game hunting and the importance of proper preparation and professional guidance. Young hunters studying their story learned about the psychological demands of hunting dangerous game and the critical importance of maintaining composure under extreme stress. Their experience demonstrated that survival in extreme situations depended as much on mental preparation and teamwork as on marksmanship and equipment. The Kodiak brown bear population continued to thrive under enhanced management protocols that had been influenced by the lessons learned from Goliath and Titan's behavioral patterns. Bears displaying similar warning signs were monitored more closely and managed more aggressively to prevent the development of dangerous human-wildlife conflicts. 20 years after their hunt, Eric Sanders would stand before his mounted trophy and reflect on how a 3-day hunting trip had shaped the rest of his life. The massive bear that had nearly killed him had become a teacher, showing him both the incredible power of Alaska's wilderness and his own capacity to face and overcome extreme challenges. "Goliath was the greatest adversary I ever faced," Eric would tell his grandchildren as they stared in awe at the enormous skull and hide. "But he was also the greatest teacher. He showed me what courage really means and what it takes to survive when everything depends on making the right decisions under pressure." The legacy of their hunt would continue for generations, inspiring new hunters while warning them about the extreme dangers that could be encountered in Alaska's wilderness. Their story had become part of the culture of North American hunting, a reminder that the pursuit of dangerous game remained one of the few activities where modern humans could test themselves against the raw power of nature. In the end, the 3 men who had traveled to Kodiak Island in search of trophy bears had found something far more significant. They had discovered their own capacity for courage, survival, and growth in the face of mortal danger. Their experience had transformed them from hunters into educators, from adventure seekers into advocates for safety and conservation. The massive skull of Goliath would remain in Eric's home for the rest of his life, serving as a monument to one of the most remarkable hunting encounters in Alaska history. But more than a trophy, it had become a symbol of the complex relationship between humans and the wild creatures that still ruled vast portions of the North American continent. Their story would be told as long as hunters gathered to share tales of dangerous game and narrow escapes, a reminder that in Alaska's wilderness, the line between predator and prey remained as thin as it had been when the first humans ventured into bear country thousands of years ago. The Sanders brothers and Sam Rodriguez had crossed that line and returned to tell the tale, forever changed by their encounter with the kings of Kodiak Island. The next stories. Polar bear devours whole family in tent, July 4th, 2025. The tundra stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast expanse of permafrost and scattered rocks that seemed to breathe with an ancient primordial menace. Dr. Mark Johnson adjusted his binoculars for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, scanning the horizon where the ice met the steel-grey waters of Hudson Bay. The midnight sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that danced and shifted like living things across the barren landscape. At 41, Mark had spent the better part of his career studying climate change in the Arctic. But this expedition to Churchill, Manitoba, felt different somehow. More urgent, more final. "Dad, look at this!" Lily's voice carried across the campsite, bright with 12-year-old enthusiasm despite the late hour. She held up a fragment of bleached driftwood, weathered smooth by countless seasons of ice and wind. "It looks like a whalebone!" Mark lowered his binoculars and smiled at his daughter, though something cold seemed to settle in his chest. The isolation out here was complete, absolute, in a way that city dwellers could never truly comprehend. The nearest settlement was 47 miles southeast, accessible only by helicopter or a grueling trek across terrain that could kill the unprepared within hours. They were alone with the vastness, the silence, and whatever creatures called this desolate place home. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," he called back, his voice carrying farther than it should have in the thin air. "Add it to your collection, but stay close to camp." Susan Johnson looked up from where she was adjusting the guy lines on their heavy-duty Arctic tent, her auburn hair whipping in the constant wind. At 38, She had the lean, efficient build of someone who had spent years following her husband into remote corners of the world. But even she seemed diminished by the scale of this place. The tent, rated for extreme Arctic conditions, looked like a small orange dot against the immensity of the tundra. "Mark, I've been thinking," she said, walking over to where he stood with his equipment. "Maybe we should have brought the satellite phone after all." He shook his head, though he had been having the same thought with increasing frequency. "The whole point was to disconnect, remember? To show the kids what true wilderness looks like before it's gone." He gestured toward the retreating ice edge. "This place might not exist in 50 years. 9-year-old Noah emerged from behind a cluster of boulders, his face flushed with excitement and exertion. He carried a small notebook and a pencil, documenting everything with the methodical intensity that reminded Mark so much of himself at that age. "I found polar bear tracks, Dad. Really old ones, but you can still see the claw marks in the mud." The words hit Mark like a physical blow. He had been monitoring polar bear activity in the region for months, using satellite data and reports from local Inuit guides. The population was stressed, hungry, and increasingly unpredictable as sea ice continued to diminish. Traditional hunting grounds were disappearing, forcing the massive predators to range farther inland in search of food. "Show me," Mark said, following his son toward the rocky outcropping. The tracks were indeed old, probably from the spring thaw, but they were unmistakably those of a large male polar bear. The front paw prints measured nearly 12 inches across, with deep gouges from claws that could grow to over 3 inches in length. Mark knelt beside the impressions, running his fingers along the edges, while a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic wind settled deep in his bones. "How old do you think they are?" Noah asked, his voice hushed with a mixture of excitement and something that might have been fear. "Several weeks, maybe more," Mark replied, though he wasn't entirely certain. The permafrost preserved tracks far longer than soil in temperate climates, and the constant freeze-thaw cycles could make dating difficult. What concerned him more was the direction the tracks were heading, directly toward the area where they had established their camp. As they walked back toward the tent, Mark found himself scanning the landscape with new intensity. Polar bears were ambush predators, capable of moving with surprising stealth despite their massive size. An adult male could weigh over 1,500 pounds and cover short distances at speeds of up to 25 miles per hour. They were also incredibly intelligent, often using terrain features and weather conditions to mask their approach. The family had arrived at the remote research site 3 days earlier, transported by helicopter from Churchill, along with their camping equipment and supplies for a 2-week expedition. Mark's research focused on measuring permafrost degradation and its impact on the local ecosystem, but the trip also served as an adventure for his family, a chance to experience one of the last truly wild places on Earth. Their campsite was situated on a slight rise overlooking a series of small ponds and streams that meandered toward Hudson Bay. The location offered excellent visibility in most directions, which was one of the reasons Mark had chosen it. What he hadn't fully considered was how exposed it left them to anything approaching from the ice. Dr. Sarah Chen had recommended this particular location during their final planning meeting at the University of Minnesota. A specialist in Arctic wildlife behavior, she had assured Mark that polar bear activity in the area was minimal during the summer months. "They follow the ice," she had said, pointing to satellite imagery that showed the nearest ice flows were over 100 miles to the north. "This time of year, they're denning or following the pack ice farther north. You're more likely to see Arctic foxes than polar bears." But climate change was making the behavior of Arctic wildlife increasingly unpredictable. Traditional patterns that had remained stable for thousands of years were breaking down as temperatures rose and ice patterns shifted. Polar bears were being forced to adapt or die, and adaptation often meant taking risks they would never have considered in the past. The Johnson family's guide, Tommy Beargrease, was a 63-year-old Cree elder who had spent his entire life in the region around Churchill. He had initially been skeptical about the family bringing young children into such remote territory, especially during the summer when polar bears were most desperate and unpredictable. "The bears, they're not the same anymore," Tommy had told Mark during their pre-expedition briefing. "Used to be you could predict where they'd be, when they'd move. Now," he had shrugged, a gesture that seemed to encompass decades of accumulated wisdom about a world that was changing too fast to understand. Tommy was scheduled to return with the helicopter in 11 days to transport the family back to Churchill. Until then, they were entirely on their own, dependent on the equipment they had brought and Mark's experience in remote wilderness survival. The evening of July 3rd unfolded with the surreal quality of an Arctic summer, where the sun never quite set and time seemed to lose its normal meaning. The temperature hovered around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, warm by Arctic standards, but still requiring multiple layers of clothing to prevent hypothermia. A constant wind blew from the northwest, carrying with it the scent of ice and something else, a wild, musky odor that Mark couldn't quite identify. Susan prepared dinner on their compact camp stove, heating canned soup and preparing sandwiches from the dried provisions they had packed. The children explored the immediate area around the campsite, collecting interesting rocks and documenting the sparse plant life that managed to survive in the harsh conditions. "I'm starting to understand why the Inuit have so many words for ice," Lily said, settling down beside the camp stove with her collection of specimens. "Everything here is about survival, isn't it?" Mark nodded, impressed as always by his daughter's perceptiveness. "The traditional knowledge of the people who live here goes back thousands of years. They understand this environment in ways that science is only beginning to appreciate." As the family ate their simple meal, Mark found himself studying the landscape with increasing unease. The endless daylight that was so characteristic of Arctic summers also meant that there was no natural darkness to provide concealment or psychological comfort. They were visible from miles away, and anything watching them would remain visible as well if they knew where to look. The wind began to pick up as they finished eating, gusting to what Mark estimated was around 30 miles per hour. It made conversation difficult and added an element of white noise that could easily mask the approach of any large animal. Mark made a mental note to check the weather forecast on their emergency radio, though he knew that Arctic weather could change with little warning. "I want everyone to stay close to camp tonight," he announced as Susan cleaned the dishes. "The wind is picking up and visibility could become an issue." Noah looked disappointed. "I wanted to explore those rocks over by the stream." "Tomorrow," Mark promised. "Right now, I want to make sure everything is secure." They spent the next hour ensuring that all their equipment was properly stowed and that the tent was securely anchored. The structure was designed to withstand extreme conditions, with aluminum poles rated for winds up to 70 miles per hour and a rainfly that could shed snow and ice. The interior was spacious enough for the family's sleeping bags and personal gear, with a small vestibule for cooking and equipment storage. As they prepared for sleep, Mark conducted a final survey of the campsite. He checked the perimeter for any signs of animal activity, examined their food storage containers to ensure they were properly sealed, and verified that their emergency equipment was easily accessible. The satellite radio was their only means of communication with the outside world in case of emergency, though its effective range was limited by the terrain and weather conditions. The family settled into their sleeping bags around midnight, though the concept of night was largely meaningless in the land of the midnight sun. The constant daylight took some adjustment, and Mark knew that the children might have difficulty sleeping without the familiar rhythm of darkness and dawn. Lily read by LED lantern for nearly an hour, absorbed in a book about Arctic explorers, while Noah sketched in his notebook by the dim light filtering through the tent fabric. Susan reviewed her own journal entries, documenting their experiences for the book she planned to write about the expedition. Mark lay awake longer than the others, listening to the sounds of the Arctic night. The wind created a constant backdrop of noise, whistling through rocks and across the open tundra. Occasionally, he could hear the distant splash of waves against ice carried on the wind from Hudson Bay. Once, he thought he heard something else, a low, huffing sound that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the immediate campsite. He unzipped the tent flap slightly and peered out into the grey twilight. The landscape appeared empty, but Mark knew that appearances could be deceiving in country like this. Polar bears were capable of moving with remarkable stealth, using natural features for concealment while they observed potential prey from a distance. After several minutes of careful observation, Mark convinced himself that the sound had been his imagination, or perhaps the wind playing tricks with the terrain. He rezipped the tent and settled back into his sleeping bag, though sleep continued to elude him for several more hours. The family woke on the morning of July 4th to the sound of wind buffeting the tent with increased intensity. Mark checked his watch and realized they had slept later than usual. It was nearly 10 o'clock, though the quality of light outside made it impossible to judge time without instruments. "Happy 4th of July," Susan mumbled from her sleeping bag. "Nothing says American independence like camping in the Canadian Arctic." Mark smiled despite his growing unease about the weather conditions. The wind had definitely increased during the night, and he could hear what sounded like ice crystals hitting the tent fabric. A check of their weather radio confirmed his suspicions. A storm system was moving in from the northwest, bringing with it the possibility of freezing rain and winds gusting to over 50 miles per hour. "Looks like we might be tent-bound for a while," he announced as the family began their morning routine. "There's a weather system moving in." The children accepted this news with good grace, understanding that wilderness travel required flexibility and patience. They spent the morning playing card games and reading while Mark monitored the weather situation and checked their equipment. By early afternoon, the storm had arrived in earnest. Freezing rain drummed against the tent with increasing intensity, and the wind howled across the tundra with a ferocity that made conversation nearly impossible. Mark checked the tent's anchor points every hour, ensuring that the structure remained secure against the buffeting. It was during one of these inspections, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, that he saw the first clear sign of immediate danger. Approximately 200 yards to the northwest, partially concealed behind a cluster of large boulders, something large and pale moved against the dark stone. Mark watched through his binoculars, his heart beginning to pound as the shape resolved into the unmistakable profile of a polar bear. The animal was massive, easily 10 feet long and probably weighing well over 1,000 pounds. Its fur appeared yellowish-white against the grey stone, and Mark could see the characteristic black nose and eyes that marked it as an adult male. The bear was moving slowly, deliberately, using the storm as cover while it investigated the scent of the human camp. Mark's mouth went dry as he realized the implications of what he was seeing. Polar bears were not naturally afraid of humans. They were apex predators that had never learned to fear anything. If this animal had detected their presence and decided to investigate, the family was in mortal danger. He watched through the binoculars as the bear lifted its massive head, testing the wind. Even through the storm, Mark could see the animal's nostrils flaring as it processed the complex scent signature of their campsite. Bears had an extraordinarily well-developed sense of smell, capable of detecting odors from miles away. The aroma of cooking food, human bodies, and camping equipment would have created a distinct olfactory beacon that could be followed even in adverse weather conditions. The bear began moving again, this time more directly toward their campsite. It moved with the fluid, purposeful gait of a predator that had made a decision. Mark estimated that at its current pace, the animal would reach their tent within 15 minutes. He backed away from the tent flap, his mind racing through their limited options. The emergency radio could potentially summon help, but rescue would take hours, even under ideal conditions. In the current storm, helicopter evacuation would be impossible. Their food and equipment were stored in bear-resistant containers, but those would provide no protection for the family members themselves. The tent, while robust enough to withstand extreme weather, was essentially transparent to a polar bear. The animal's claws and teeth could shred the fabric in seconds, and its weight alone would be enough to collapse the entire structure. There was nowhere to run. The nearest substantial shelter was miles away across terrain that would be nearly impossible to traverse in the current conditions. Mark's hands shook slightly as he reached for the radio, but he forced himself to remain calm. Panic would be of no use to his family in the next few minutes. He needed to think clearly, assess their options, and make decisions that would give them the best chance of survival. "Susan," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the storm, "we need to wake the kids. Right now." Something in his tone immediately alerted his wife to the severity of the situation. She sat up in her sleeping bag, her eyes wide with concern. "What is it?" "Polar bear," Mark replied, keeping his voice as steady as possible, "about 200 yards out and heading this way." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, their implications too large to fully grasp. Susan's face went pale, and Mark could see her mind working through the same grim calculations that had occupied his thoughts moments earlier. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice controlled but tight with fear. Mark was already reaching for their emergency supplies, including the bear spray that he had hoped they would never need to use. The canister contained concentrated capsaicin, designed to deter aggressive bears, but its effectiveness against a determined polar bear was questionable at best. The spray had an effective range of only about 20 feet and could be rendered useless by strong winds. "We wake the kids gently," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Get everyone dressed and ready to move, and we pray that the bear loses interest and moves on." But even as he spoke the words, Mark knew that hope was likely futile. Polar bears were not easily deterred once they had committed to investigating a potential food source. The animal outside had probably been watching their campsite for hours, possibly days, learning their routines and waiting for the right moment to approach. Lily woke first, her 12-year-old instincts immediately alert to the tension in her parents' voices. "What's wrong?" she asked, sitting up in her sleeping bag. "We need everyone to get dressed very quietly," Susan explained, her voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. "There's a polar bear near our camp, and we might need to move quickly." Noah woke at the sound of voices, his 9-year-old mind initially confused by the urgency he sensed around him. "A real polar bear?" he asked, excitement and fear warring in his voice. "Yes, honey," Mark replied, helping his son into his jacket and boots. "We need to be very quiet and very still while we figure out what to do." Through the tent fabric, they could now hear new sounds over the storm. The heavy breathing of a large animal and the soft padding of massive paws on the frozen ground. The bear was close now, probably within 50 yards of their tent. Mark could smell it too. A wild, musky odor that spoke of ice and fish and something fundamentally predatory. The family huddled together in the center of the tent, fully dressed and ready to move, but with nowhere to go. Mark clutched the bear spray in one hand and the emergency radio in the other, though he knew that both would likely prove inadequate against what was approaching. Outside, the sounds grew closer and more distinct. They could hear the bear's claws clicking against rocks as it moved, and the rhythmic huffing of its breath as it tested the air. The animal was taking its time, possibly trying to determine exactly how many humans were in the tent and whether they posed any threat. "I can see it," Lily whispered, pointing toward a section of the tent wall where a massive shadow had appeared. The silhouette was enormous, easily dwarfing any land animal the children had ever seen. The bear was now directly outside their tent, separated from the family by only a thin layer of fabric. Mark could hear it sniffing loudly, investigating the scents that emanated from their temporary shelter. The sound was terrifyingly intimate, like listening to a tiger breathing through a bedroom window. For several agonizing minutes, the bear remained stationary just outside the tent. Mark could track its position by the sounds it made and the way its shadow moved across the tent walls. The animal seemed to be conducting a thorough investigation, possibly trying to understand exactly what it had discovered. Then, without warning, the bear began to move around the tent's perimeter. Mark could hear its footsteps as it slowly circled their shelter, probing for weaknesses or points of entry. The methodical nature of the animal's behavior was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the encounter. This was not a random meeting, but a calculated assessment by an intelligent predator. "Daddy, I'm scared," Noah whispered, pressing close against his father's side. "I know, buddy," Mark replied, wrapping his arm around his son while keeping his eyes fixed on the tent entrance. "We're going to be okay." But even as he spoke the reassuring words, Mark knew that their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. The bear showed no signs of losing interest, and the storm outside made any attempt at escape extremely dangerous. They were trapped with a massive predator that seemed to be growing bolder by the minute. The first physical contact came without warning. One moment the family was listening to the bear's movements around their campsite, and the next moment they felt the tent shake as something large pressed against the fabric. The pressure was enormous, and Mark could see the tent poles beginning to bend under the weight. "Stay together," he whispered urgently, pulling his family toward the center of the tent as far as possible from the walls. The bear pressed harder against the tent, and they could hear its claws beginning to tear at the fabric. The sound was like canvas being ripped, but magnified and made terrifying by the knowledge of what was causing it. Within seconds, the first small holes appeared in the tent wall, and Mark could see flashes of white fur through the tears. He raised the bear spray, though he knew it would be of limited use inside the confined space of the tent. The capsaicin could incapacitate his own family as easily as it might deter the bear, and in the close quarters, accuracy would be nearly impossible. The bear's investigation became more aggressive, and larger sections of the tent began to give way under its assault. Through the growing holes, the family could see portions of the massive animal, a section of shoulder here, a massive paw there. The bear's size was even more imposing up close, and its casual destruction of their shelter demonstrated the futility of their protective barriers. "The radio," Susan whispered urgently. "Try the radio." Mark fumbled with the emergency communicator, his hands shaking as he attempted to establish contact with the outside world. The device crackled to life, but the storm was interfering with signal transmission. He managed to broadcast a brief distress call before the radio died completely, though he had no way of knowing if the message had been received. Outside, the bear had apparently decided that its investigation was complete. The pressure against the tent walls ceased, and for a moment the family dared to hope that the animal might be losing interest. That hope was short-lived. The attack, when it came, was swift and devastating. The bear struck the tent with the full force of its massive body, collapsing the entire structure in a tangle of fabric poles and guy lines. The family found themselves trapped beneath the wreckage, disoriented and helpless as the predator continued its assault from above. Mark felt rather than saw the bear's first attempt to reach them through the collapsed tent. Massive claws raked across the fabric inches from his head, and he could hear the animal's frustrated huffing as it tried to extract its prey from the tangle of camping equipment. "Everyone stay low and move toward the tent entrance," he shouted over the sounds of destruction above them. "We need to get out from under this. Time?" But even as the family tried to crawl toward potential freedom, Mark knew that escape was likely impossible. The bear was between them and any route away from the campsite, and the animal's speed and agility made it unlikely that they could outrun it even on open ground. The tent fabric gave way completely in several places, and suddenly the bear's massive head was visible through one of the larger tiers. Its black eyes fixed on the family with unmistakable intent, and Mark could see its lips pulling back to reveal teeth that seemed impossibly large and sharp. He triggered the bear spray in desperation, sending a cloud of capsaicin directly into the animal's face. For a moment, he thought the deterrent might work. The bear pulled back with a snort of apparent irritation, but the retreat was only temporary. Within seconds, the massive predator was back, its aggression increased by the painful irritant. What followed was a nightmare of violence that seemed to unfold in slow motion despite its devastating speed. The bear's first target was the closest member of the family, which happened to be Noah. The 9-year-old had been trying to crawl toward what he thought was safety when the massive jaws closed around his torso. Mark's scream of horror was lost in the chaos of the attack. He lunged toward his son, but the bear's strength was beyond human comprehension. Noah disappeared from view, his cries cut short with terrible finality. Susan tried to shield Lily with her own body, but the bear's attention had already shifted to them. The massive paws swept aside the remaining tent fabric like it was tissue paper, and suddenly there were no barriers left between the predator and its prey. The attack continued with mechanical efficiency. The bear showed no emotion, no anger. It was simply following millions of years of evolutionary programming that had designed it to be the ultimate Arctic predator. Each member of the family was dealt with in turn, their struggles brief and futile, against an animal that had been designed by nature to kill efficiently. Mark's last coherent thought was a desperate wish that the distress call had somehow gotten through, that someone would come to investigate and at least recover their bodies. He thought about Tommy Beargrease, who would return in a week to find nothing but shredded equipment and bloodstains in the snow. The entire attack lasted less than 10 minutes from beginning to end. When it was over, the campsite was unrecognizable, a chaotic spread of torn fabric, scattered equipment, and evidence of violence that would haunt investigators for years to come. The polar bear remained at the site for several hours after the attack, feeding and then resting beside the wreckage of the tent. The storm continued to rage around the scene, slowly covering the evidence with blowing snow and ice. By the time the weather cleared, the bear had moved on, leaving behind only the devastated campsite and the beginning of a mystery that would challenge rescue workers, investigators, and wildlife experts. The first indication that something was wrong came 3 days later, on July 7th, when the Johnson family failed to make their scheduled radio check-in with the charter helicopter service in Churchill. The protocol called for daily contact at 6 p.m. local time, and Mark Johnson had been scrupulous about maintaining the schedule during the first 3 days of the expedition. Captain Jake Morrison of Northern Frontier Helicopter Services waited until 8 p.m. before placing his first call to the emergency radio frequency that the family was supposed to monitor. When that call went unanswered, he tried again every hour until midnight, his concern growing with each failed attempt at contact. Morrison was a 20-year veteran of Arctic flying, and he had transported hundreds of researchers and adventurers into the remote regions around Hudson Bay. He knew that radio silence could mean anything from equipment failure to extreme weather, but something about the Johnson expedition had been troubling him since he had dropped them off. They seemed well prepared, he told his wife Martha over coffee the morning of July 8th. But that's a hell of a remote location, especially with kids that young. Martha Morrison had been married to an Arctic pilot for 18 years, and she had learned to trust her husband's instincts about dangerous situations. "What's your gut telling you?" she asked. "That we need to get out there and have a look," Jake replied. "Weather's been rough the last few days, but it's clearing now. If they're in trouble." He didn't finish the sentence, but Martha understood the implication. In Arctic conditions, even minor problems could escalate into life-threatening emergencies with frightening speed. Hypothermia, equipment failure, or injury could render a party helpless within hours. Jake placed a call to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Detachment in Churchill, reporting the missed check-ins and requesting permission to conduct an overflight of the Johnson campsite. Sergeant Robert McKinnon, a 15-year veteran of Northern policing, understood the urgency of the situation. "How long since the last confirmed contact?" McKinnon asked. 72 hours, Morrison replied. "They were supposed to check in daily at 6 p.m. Last contact was July 4th. McKinnon checked the weather reports for the region and confirmed that the storm system had indeed been severe enough to disrupt radio communications. But 3 days of silence was beyond the normal range of equipment problems or atmospheric interference. "I'll authorize the overflight," McKinnon decided. "But I want to go with you. If there's a problem out there, we're going to need law enforcement involvement from the beginning." "Oui." The helicopter lifted off from Churchill at 11 a.m. on July 8th, carrying Morrison McKinnon and emergency medical technician David Park. The flight to the Johnson campsite would take approximately 90 minutes, covering terrain that ranged from sparse forest to open tundra to the edge of Hudson Bay ice. Morrison had made the trip dozens of times, but he never got used to the sheer emptiness of the landscape. From the air, it was possible to see for hundreds of miles in every direction, and the absence of any human presence was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. A person could disappear out here and never be found, even with extensive search efforts. "There it is," Morrison announced as they approached the GPS coordinates of the Johnson campsite, or what's left of it. Even from several hundred feet up, it was clear that something catastrophic had occurred. The orange tent that should have been a bright beacon against the tundra was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the campsite was a chaotic spread of debris scattered across a wide area. McKinnon studied the scene through binoculars as Morrison circled the site. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "That's not weather damage." The experienced sergeant had seen the aftermath of natural disasters, equipment failures, and human violence, and what lay below them bore the unmistakable signs of an animal attack. Pieces of camping equipment were scattered in patterns that suggested they had been dragged or thrown by something with tremendous strength. "Set us down upwind and at least 200 yards away," McKinnon instructed. "We don't know what did this, and it might still be in the area." Morrison found a relatively flat spot for landing, though the rocky terrain made the approach challenging. As the helicopter settled onto the tundra, the three men could see the full extent of the devastation more clearly. What had once been an organized campsite was now a debris field that extended over several acres. McKinnon was the first to exit the aircraft, his hand resting on the sidearm that was standard equipment for northern patrols. Park followed with his medical kit, though it was becoming increasingly clear that emergency medical treatment would not be required. "Bear attack," McKinnon announced grimly after a preliminary survey of the scene, "and from the look of it, a big one." The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Massive paw prints were visible in the soft ground around the former campsite, some of them clearly showing the distinctive five-toed pattern and claw marks of a polar bear. The tent had been completely destroyed, its fabric torn into ribbons and scattered across a wide area. "Where are the bodies?" Park asked, though he seemed reluctant to hear the answer. McKinnon was examining the largest concentration of debris where the tent had originally been located. "Dragged off," he said grimly. "Bears usually take their kills to a more secluded location for feeding." The search for human remains took the rest of the afternoon and proved to be one of the most grisly tasks any of the three men had ever undertaken. The polar bear had indeed dragged its victims away from the immediate campsite, but not far enough to completely conceal the evidence of what had occurred. Dr. Mark Johnson's body was found approximately 300 yards from the campsite, partially concealed beneath an overhang of rock. The condition of the remains made identification difficult, but clothing fragments and personal effects confirmed his identity. The bear had fed extensively, leaving behind evidence that would haunt the investigators for months to come. Susan Johnson was discovered in a similar location about 500 yards in the opposite direction. Like her husband, she had been subjected to predation after death, and the scene required careful documentation by investigators trained to handle extreme violence. The children's remains were found together near a small stream, approximately half a mile from the original campsite. The proximity of Lily and Noah's bodies suggested that they might have been trying to flee together when overtaken by the massive predator. The evidence indicated that death had been swift for all family members, though the subsequent predation made forensic reconstruction challenging. E.M.T. Park was forced to step away from the search area several times to compose himself. In 20 years of emergency medical service, including tours in remote communities where violent death was not uncommon, he had never encountered scenes of such devastating animal predation. "How do we even begin to process this?" he asked McKinnon as they completed their initial survey. The RCMP sergeant was already thinking about the complex investigation that would follow. "We secure the scene, document everything, and bring in specialists," he replied. "This is going to require wildlife experts, forensic investigators, and probably federal involvement." As the sun began its long descent toward the horizon, the three men established a perimeter around the attack site and began the process of preserving evidence. The helicopter was used to ferry additional personnel and equipment from Churchill, including conservation officers from Manitoba Natural Resources and members of the RCMP's Forensic Identification Unit. Dr. Angela Reeves, a wildlife biologist specializing in polar bear behavior, arrived at the scene on the evening of July 8th. She had been studying Arctic predators for over 15 years, but the Johnson attack site presented evidence of behavior that she had never documented in the wild. "This is unprecedented," she told McKinnon as they surveyed the scene by floodlight. "Polar bears do occasionally attack humans, but total family predation like this is extremely rare." Reeves began collecting evidence of the bear's behavior, including detailed measurements of paw prints, claw marks, and feeding patterns. The size of the tracks indicated a massive adult male, probably weighing well over 1,200 pounds. The animal's approach to the campsite showed signs of careful planning and observation that were characteristic of highly intelligent predators. "It stalked them," she explained to the investigators. "Probably watched the campsite for hours or even days before making its move." The attack itself shows classic polar bear predation behavior: swift, efficient, and devastating. The forensic investigation continued for 3 days, with specialists arriving from across Canada to examine different aspects of the attack. Dr. Sarah Chen, the University of Minnesota researcher who had helped plan the Johnson expedition, flew in from Minneapolis to assist with understanding the family's research objectives and equipment. Mark was meticulous about safety protocols, Chen told investigators. He understood polar bear behavior and had experience in Arctic conditions. This wasn't negligence or poor planning. This was just a tragic encounter with a desperate predator. The investigation revealed that the bear had indeed been observing the campsite for an extended period before the attack, Tracks and scat samples indicated that the animal had been in the area for at least 3 days, possibly longer. The storm that struck on July 4th had provided the bear with perfect cover for a close approach to the tent. Analysis of the attack sequence suggested that the bear had waited for the family to be confined inside their tent before making its move. The methodical destruction of the shelter and the systematic killing of each family member demonstrated behavior that was both intelligent and terrifyingly efficient. Polar bears are learning to associate human presence with food, Dr. Reeves explained to the media during a press conference in Churchill. Climate change is forcing them to explore new survival strategies, and unfortunately, some of those strategies now include predation on humans. The recovery of the Johnson family's remains required specialized equipment and personnel trained in handling extreme forensic situations. Each body had to be carefully excavated and documented before being transported back to Churchill for formal identification and autopsy. The autopsies, conducted by Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief medical examiner for northern Manitoba, confirmed that all 4 family members had died from massive trauma consistent with polar bear attack. Death had been swift in each case, a small mercy given the circumstances. The children didn't suffer, Dr. Williams told the family's relatives during a private briefing. The attack was so sudden and severe that unconsciousness would have been immediate. News of the Johnson family tragedy broke on July 10th, sending shockwaves through both the scientific community and the general public. The story of a family completely destroyed by a polar bear attack captured international attention and sparked debates about wilderness safety, climate change, and the increasing danger posed by desperate Arctic predators. Tommy Beargrease, the Cree elder who had been scheduled to collect the family, was devastated by the news. He had known that the expedition carried risks, but he had never imagined that an entire family could be lost to predation. "The land is changing," he told reporters outside his home in Churchill. "The animals, they're changing too. The old ways of predicting where the bears will be, when they'll hunt, those don't work anymore." The University of Minnesota established a memorial fund in the Johnson family's name, dedicating it to research into human-wildlife conflict in Arctic regions. Mark Johnson's climate change research was published posthumously, serving as both a scientific contribution and a memorial to his dedication to understanding environmental change. Susan Johnson's planned book about the expedition was never completed, but her journal entries from the first 3 days of the trip were published as an article in National Geographic. The writing captured the wonder and excitement of experiencing true wilderness, making the tragic ending even more poignant. The investigation into the attack itself concluded after 6 weeks of intensive analysis. The final report, submitted to federal wildlife authorities and the RCMP, painted a picture of a desperate predator forced by climate change to explore increasingly dangerous hunting strategies. The polar bear responsible for the attack was never located, despite extensive tracking efforts by conservation officers and Inuit hunters. The animal had disappeared into the vast wilderness of Hudson Bay's coastline, leaving behind only the devastating evidence of its encounter with the Johnson family. Dr. Reeves continued her research into polar bear behavior modification, using the Johnson attack as a case study in predator adaptation to environmental change. Her work helped inform new safety protocols for researchers and adventurers traveling in polar bear habitat. "We can't let this tragedy discourage scientific research in the Arctic," she wrote in her final report. "But we must acknowledge that the rules of engagement with apex predators are changing as rapidly as the climate itself." The Johnson family's deaths became a catalyst for increased research into human-wildlife conflict in Arctic regions. Federal funding was allocated to study the changing behavior patterns of polar bears and to develop improved safety protocols for people working or traveling in their habitat. New regulations were implemented requiring larger expedition parties, enhanced communication equipment, and mandatory wildlife monitoring for research groups traveling to remote Arctic locations. The isolated campsite where the Johnson family had died was declared off-limits to future expeditions. In Churchill, the tragedy became part of the local community's ongoing struggle to coexist with one of the world's most dangerous predators. The town's polar bear monitoring program was expanded, and new early warning systems were developed to track the movements of potentially dangerous animals. The psychological impact of the Johnson family tragedy extended far beyond the immediate investigation and safety improvements. Dr. Williams, the medical examiner who had conducted the autopsies, required extensive counseling to deal with the traumatic nature of the case. "I've seen a lot of death in my career," she told colleagues months after the investigation concluded, "but nothing prepared me for the reality of complete predation of an entire family. It changes your understanding of our place in the natural world." The three investigators who had first arrived at the scene, Morrison, McKinnon, and Park, also struggled with the psychological aftermath of their discovery. Morrison eventually took early retirement from his helicopter service, unable to return to the remote regions where he had once worked with confidence. McKinnon transferred to urban policing in Winnipeg, telling colleagues that he needed to work in an environment where the greatest dangers were human rather than natural. Park continued his emergency medical work but requested reassignment to urban areas where he would be less likely to encounter extreme wilderness trauma. The Johnson family's hometown of Minneapolis held a memorial service that drew thousands of attendees, including colleagues from the university, fellow Arctic researchers, and family friends who had known them as adventurous but responsible parents. The service highlighted not just their tragic deaths, but their contributions to climate science and their dedication to sharing the natural world with their children. Lily Johnson School established a scholarship fund in her name, aimed at encouraging young women to pursue careers in environmental science. Noah Johnson's elementary school created a nature exploration program that emphasized both the wonder and the dangers of wilderness environments. The media coverage of the tragedy evolved over time, from sensational headlines about killer polar bears to more nuanced discussions about climate change and its impact on both human and animal populations. Environmental groups used the Johnson family's story to highlight the urgent need for action on global warming. "This tragedy illustrates the real-world consequences of environmental change," wrote Dr. James Patterson, director of the Arctic Research Institute. "As ice habitats disappear and traditional food sources become scarce, encounters between desperate predators and human populations will become increasingly common." The polar bear population around Hudson Bay continued to decline in the years following the Johnson attack, as sea ice formation became increasingly unreliable and traditional hunting grounds disappeared. The desperate behavior that had likely triggered the attack became more common as bears were forced to search for alternative food sources. Conservation officers in the region reported increasing numbers of aggressive bear encounters, though none approached the complete devastation of the Johnson family attack. The tragedy served as a grim preview of the conflicts that would likely increase as climate change continued to disrupt Arctic ecosystems. 3 years after the attack, Dr. Reeves published a comprehensive study of polar bear behavior modification in response to environmental stress. The Johnson case was featured prominently as an example of how climate change was fundamentally altering predator-prey relationships in Arctic regions. "We are witnessing the breakdown of behavioral patterns that have been stable for thousands of years," she wrote. "The tragic loss of the Johnson family represents not just an isolated incident, but a harbinger of the conflicts that await us as the Arctic continues to warm." The remote campsite where the family had died remained undisturbed by human presence, slowly being reclaimed by the harsh Arctic environment. Seasonal freeze-thaw cycles gradually scattered the last remnants of their equipment, and within 5 years, only the most careful observer could detect any evidence of the tragedy that had occurred there. Tommy Beargrease made annual trips to the site, following traditional Cree customs for honoring the dead and maintaining spiritual balance with the natural world. He left small offerings and spoke prayers for the family members who had died so far from home. "The land remembers," he told his grandson during one of these visits. "We must remember too, so that others can learn from what happened here." The scientific research that Mark Johnson had been conducting was eventually completed by other researchers, using data and methodologies that he had developed. The findings contributed to a growing body of evidence about the rate and scale of permafrost degradation in Arctic regions, information that proved crucial for understanding global climate change. Susan Johnson's writing about wilderness experiences was collected and published 5 years after her death, with proceeds going to support Arctic research and safety education. Her vivid descriptions of the family's first 3 days in the wilderness served as both a celebration of natural beauty and a reminder of its inherent dangers. The children's memory was preserved not just in scholarship funds, but in educational programs that emphasized the importance of balancing adventure with prudent safety measures. Their story became part of wilderness safety curricula at universities across North America. The helicopter pilot Jake Morrison never returned to the Arctic regions where he had worked for 20 years. The discovery of the Johnson family's remains had ended his career and forced him to confront the reality that his job involved transporting people to places where they could simply disappear. "I used to think of the wilderness as this pristine, beautiful place," he told his wife years later. "Now I know it's also a place where a family can be erased in 10 minutes, leaving nothing but scattered bones and memories." The RCMP investigation officially closed after 18 months, though the case file remained active in case new evidence ever emerged. Sergeant McKinnon's final report ran to over 400 pages and included detailed analysis of everything from polar bear behavior patterns to climate data for the region. The report's conclusions were sobering. The Johnson family had done everything right, followed all safety protocols, and still fallen victim to a predator whose behavior had been altered by environmental pressures beyond human control. It was a stark reminder that wilderness travel, especially in Arctic regions, would never be entirely safe. The tragedy also prompted changes in how search and rescue operations were conducted in remote Arctic regions. New protocols called for immediate deployment of resources when communication was lost with expedition parties, and enhanced coordination between Canadian and American rescue services. Dr. Chen from the University of Minnesota eventually returned to Arctic research, but never again recommended research sites as remote as the location where the Johnson family had died. Her subsequent expeditions included larger teams, enhanced communication equipment, and mandatory check-ins every 12 hours instead of daily. "We learned that the wilderness doesn't respect our expertise or our caution," she explained to her graduate students. "It simply exists, following rules that we're still trying to understand." The polar bear responsible for the attack was never identified or tracked, despite extensive efforts by wildlife authorities. DNA evidence from the scene was compared with samples from bears captured or observed in the region, but no definitive match was ever established. The animal likely lived for several more years in the Hudson Bay region, possibly without ever again encountering humans. Whether it modified its behavior as a result of the Johnson attack or simply moved on to other survival strategies remained unknown to researchers. In the years following the tragedy, polar bear attacks on humans in the Arctic became more frequent, though none approached the devastating completeness of the Johnson family incident. Each new attack was analyzed in the context of the original case, contributing to a growing understanding of how climate change was altering predator behavior. The Johnson family's story became a case study taught in university courses on wildlife management, wilderness safety, and environmental change. Their death served as a stark reminder that human expansion into wild spaces carried inherent risks that could never be completely eliminated. The remote research station that Mark Johnson had planned to establish at the site was never built. The location was deemed too dangerous for permanent human presence, and alternative sites were selected for ongoing climate research in the region. The tent site itself became a pilgrimage destination for some wildlife researchers and adventure travelers, though access remained difficult and dangerous. Small memorial cairns were occasionally constructed by visitors, only to be scattered by seasonal storms and the endless cycles of Arctic weather. The financial impact of the tragedy extended beyond the immediate families to include insurance companies, expedition outfitters, and research institutions. New policies were developed for coverage of Arctic expeditions, with higher premiums and more stringent safety requirements. The University of Minnesota faced multiple lawsuits from the Johnson family's relatives, claiming that inadequate safety planning had contributed to the tragedy. The cases were eventually settled out of court, with the university agreeing to implement enhanced safety protocols for all future Arctic research. The psychological trauma of the case continued to affect investigators and rescue workers years after the events. A support group was established for first responders who had dealt with extreme wildlife attacks, providing counseling and peer support for those struggling with the aftermath of such cases. Dr. Williams, the medical examiner, eventually wrote a book about her experiences with unusual death investigations, devoting a chapter to the Johnson family case. The book became a resource for other medical professionals dealing with extreme forensic situations. The media coverage of the tragedy gradually shifted from sensational reporting to more serious examination of climate change and its impacts on both human and animal populations. The Johnson family story became a powerful illustration of the unintended consequences of environmental change. Environmental groups incorporated the tragedy into their advocacy for action on climate change, arguing that the family's deaths represented a preview of the conflicts that would emerge as traditional ecosystems continued to collapse. The Johnson family died at the front lines of climate change, wrote environmental activist Dr. Margaret Foster. Their tragedy is a warning about the price of environmental inaction. The children's schools established ongoing memorial programs that evolved over time, from simple scholarships to comprehensive environmental education initiatives. Students learned about both the wonder of natural environments and the importance of respecting their inherent dangers. The annual memorial services held in Minneapolis drew smaller crowds as years passed, but the core group of family, friends, colleagues, and fellow researchers continued to gather to remember the family and reflect on the lessons of their tragedy. Tommy Beargrease continued his annual visits to the attack site until his death from natural causes 8 years later. His grandson maintained the tradition, ensuring that the Johnson family's memory remained honored according to traditional Cree customs. The scientific community's response to the tragedy included not just improved safety protocols, but also renewed focus on the rapid pace of environmental change in Arctic regions. The Johnson family's research was completed and expanded, contributing to crucial understanding of climate impacts. The horror of the Johnson family's final moments was something that investigators and family members struggled to process for years. The speed and completeness of the attack left no opportunity for heroism or last-minute rescues, just the sudden transition from family vacation to tragedy. Dr. Reeves's continued research into polar bear behavior eventually led to the development of new deterrent technologies, including enhanced bear spray formulations and portable alarm systems designed specifically for Arctic conditions. None of these innovations could have saved the Johnson family, but they offered hope for preventing future tragedies. The question of whether the attack could have been prevented haunted everyone involved in the case. Enhanced communication equipment might have allowed for faster rescue response, but the attack itself had been so swift that even immediate help would likely have arrived too late. The wilderness area where the family died eventually became part of an expanded protected zone, managed jointly by Canadian federal authorities and local Inuit communities. The designation was intended to preserve both the natural environment and the memory of those who had died there. Climate scientists continued to cite the Johnson family case as an example of the unexpected consequences of environmental change. The tragedy became part of the growing evidence that global warming was creating unpredictable and often dangerous disruptions in natural systems. The polar bear population around Hudson Bay continued to decline, adding poignancy to the tragedy. The desperate animal that had killed the Johnson family was itself a victim of environmental changes beyond its control, forced to adopt increasingly risky survival strategies. The legacy of the Johnson family tragedy extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of their deaths. Their story became part of the larger narrative of human interaction with a changing natural world, serving as both warning and inspiration for future generations of researchers and adventurers. In the end, the Johnson family's deaths represented both the wonder and the terror of the natural world, a reminder that despite all our technology and knowledge, we remain vulnerable to forces that operate according to rules far older and more fundamental than human civilization. The empty tundra where they died continued its ancient cycles of freeze and thaw, storm and calm, life and death. The polar bears continued their increasingly desperate search for food and survival, and somewhere in the balance between human ambition and natural law, the memory of 4 lives lost in 10 minutes of Arctic horror served as a permanent reminder of the price of venturing into the wild places of the world. The Johnson family had sought to understand and document the changes occurring in one of Earth's most remote and beautiful environments. In their deaths, they became part of the story they had come to tell, a story of environmental change, adaptation, and the sometimes tragic consequences of the collision between human goals and natural realities. Their names joined the long list of those who had been claimed by the wilderness they sought to understand, adding to the eternal dialogue between human ambition and the untamed power of the natural world. In the vast expanse of the Canadian Arctic, their memory became part of the landscape itself, a reminder that some places remain forever beyond human control or comprehension.